Okay. Thanks everybody for coming and hanging out with us today. We'll introduce ourselves. I'm Aaron and this is Bryn. Together we founded our company Rooted, and we are primarily going to be a clone nursery. So once we get our applications allowed, once the state opens up application for all the various licenses, we'll probably be applying for a micro license and a nursery license. And, in the meantime, we're just trying to get our brand out there. And one of the ways we do that is by offering education because we have a big commitment to seeing people learn about how to grow naturally, which is what we do and what we advocate for. So I have a background in farming in Colorado. I was out in Colorado for the past 13 years and recently moved back here, and I grew up here. So originally from Lafayette, and all my family's still here. And when the state legalized, I thought, it's been long enough in Colorado and time to go back home and make a run for it in the New York market. So let's see, I've farmed on all different scales. So, outdoors up to a couple of 100 acres of all cannabis, and indoors on all the way from a small grow tent or a closet all the way up to, I worked in a over 300,000 square foot mega facility in downtown Denver. So, and everywhere in between. So I've got a lot of experience in growing a lot of different ways. Sometimes, the conventional methods for cannabis are, involve soilless mediums and a lot of nutrients, chemical fertilizers or organic fertilizers. But we're going to make a distinction between, that methodology of growing and what we teach today, and just get you guys educated on how to do things a little more naturally and sustainably, and also get better results. Because we believe, as do many of the competitions and connoisseurs in the industry, the best cannabis is grown naturally with plain water, maybe some homemade inputs, and it gets its nutrition from the microbiology rather than some kind of a liquid formula or a nutrient or fertilizer. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. You want to talk about your background?
Yeah, so I don't have as much cannabis experience. I'm newer to that field, but I grew up on a dairy farm just over in Pompey. I'm a farm girl. And for me, it's really about being regenerative and taking care of our land and taking care of our plants in a way that nature has perfected, right, over all this time. So for me, it's really about that and sharing that passion with all of you. I mean, I also bring to the business some design elements, and I'm an educator. My background is in teaching. So for me, the education and really being excited about regenerative farming is where I come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's take a little survey of who's in the room with you guys. How many people here are currently farming?
Yeah. Well, what do you
gardening.
Consider farming, right? You asked, what do you consider farming? What do you consider farming? If you consider yourself a farmer, you're a farmer.
Yeah. We can it, we farm it, we can it, we eat it.
Aaron and I are farmers too. We're not doing it outside right now, but we're farmers.
Yeah.
In vegetables, and I've got like 150 by 150 foot garden I keep myself. I got equipment.
Nice.
And I rent the rest of the farm to a farmer.
All for yourself, your 150 square? Okay, cool.
Good for you.
Nice. Yeah, that's something that we want to see more of. We used to feed ourselves by growing food in our local communities. And a fun fact is that the Victory Gardens it was World War II, right? Yeah. During that time period, over half of the food that we fed ourselves in this country came from Victory Gardens. And so we know from history and proof that growing small scale in natural ways can feed the world. And so we're here to talk about that specifically.
I try to grow 3 staples,
Yeah,
and then you can do some other stuff.
sure.
That's what you're gonna eat.
Yeah. And
The 3 sisters that your boy had, you know.
oh yeah, I think I remember that.
Corn's not so good. Bang to the bottom.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
Corn's changed a lot.
Yeah. Well, and maybe you're growing 3 staple crops, but your neighbor's growing 3 different ones, and somebody down the road is growing other things, and you know.
We got onions and spices.
Yeah, yeah. So, who here is growing cannabis specifically? Okay, like half the room, maybe part of the room. These principles apply to everything, by the way. You know, we're going to talk today a lot more specifically about making what is kind of like a potting soil mix, but it's, you know, the way we're going to talk about doing it can be done outdoors in your garden beds as well. So,
Like a starter soil.
yeah. So the last time we did the class, we had these feedback cards out. And for you guys today, we want to ask that you go ahead and fill them out at the end or whenever you feel like it. But they're feedback for us so that we can learn how to improve our education offerings and also to find out what you guys want to hear more about. Because this is a series and we're doing this about once every 5 or 6 weeks. So the topic today.
Yeah, just quick though, who was here for the first class? So only a small section of you. If we
Nice.
offered that intro class again, would the rest of you be interested in doing that?
It was really good.
Oh, thank you.
It really was.
Yeah.
Sure. What did it cover?
We covered like a lot of things very quickly. So then each of the classes subsequently go into things more in depth. So we did talk about soil very briefly in the intro class, but the intro class is like a couple hours long and we hit on things just real briefly.
Yeah, it's an overview.
We are definitely going to talk about things today that we started to talk about last time. And every time we do that, we'll say, as we started to talk about last time, and now we're going to go more into depth. If there's something we talk about today and we're talking about it as if you guys know what it is and you don't, please stop us and ask. We don't want you to be lost this whole time, okay? One of the things I said to you yesterday when we were going over it, we didn't have a slide about the soil food web, and we talked about it a lot. And I'm like, not everybody was at that first class. We should probably cover it again. So it's right in the beginning now.
Yeah.
But if there's anything else that you're not sure about, please stop us. We'd rather everybody be on the same page the whole time than confused.
Right.
Okay?
We have plenty of time today, and I think there's only like 16 slides with actual content to talk about on them. So we'd love for it to be as interactive as possible. Feel free to raise your hands or just call out if you have any questions, and want to make sure that we're thoroughly covering everything and leaving you guys with a solid understanding when you leave the class today. So, and then just logistical stuff. If you need water, there's a water tank right there. So feel free to hit that up. And then there's a porta potty at the end of the greenhouses. We don't have a regular bathroom here yet.
And
So-
we are going to take a break partway through too. So.
Oh, yes. We didn't do that last time, and we thought that would be good.
Twitchy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Tell me when we're doing slides because I can't see your screen.
yeah. Okay, go ahead. So that said, let's get started. So today's topic, as you know, is on building soil, and we've divided it into 3 sections. The first one is how to design your soil mix. So what makes a good soil and what are the ingredients that will give you everything that you need to have a good blend of soil. 2 is how do you make that? How do you actually put it together and set up your soil? And the 3rd is how do you maintain it, which may be the most, it's equally as important as the design, because the soil that we're talking about making here today is meant to be a long-term soil. So a lot of cannabis farmers in particular, and if you guys have seen how it's done on a commercial scale, a lot of times they're smaller containers, pots of a soilless potting mix, and farmers will use that container and the soil in it one time and then just throw it out, which is crazy. It's totally unsustainable for one. not just in terms of like impact on the environment, which it does have, but for your business. So everything we talk about today is also going to be focused on maximizing profitability. If you're doing this for a living, then we want to talk about how you can keep your expenses as low as possible and get the most out of your crops, profit margin wise. So, next one. So what is a good soil? And what are the qualities that we want it to have? What are the combination of ingredients that's going to make a good soil? That's what we're going to start with. Who's got some ideas? Does anybody want to share? Like, what do you think makes a good soil?
Compost with tilth in it.
So we had somebody say compost and somebody say tilth,
Tilth,
Yep.
drainage,
drainage, texture.
Yep. Very good.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Water retention.
Water retention.
Perfect. All right. So all of those answers are correct and components of the different things that create a good soil. And we'll hit on all of those things specifically, actually. Go to the next one. But before we do that, I wanted to do a quick review of the soil food web, okay? Because obviously most of you guys weren't here for the last class. But the soil food web is a term that refers to the microbiology and other higher forms of life that are in your soil, all the way up to like worms, bugs, bacteria, fungus, protozoa, anything that could be alive. And a lot of people don't realize, but good soil, one spoonful of it literally has billions of different microorganisms alive in it, like billions. And the variety of species is in the hundreds of thousands. So what we're talking about is an entire world. It's like an entire ecosystem that lives in your soil. And if you've ever seen good soil under a microscope, you can actually see all of these different members of the soil food web moving around, interacting with each other, eating each other, pooping and peeing, dying, and it's the circle of life. It's like they call it the soil food web rather than a food chain, because all the different parts are interacting, not just with they don't just eat one thing below them and then something above them eats that in the chain. It's kind of like everything's eating each other and feeding each other. And, it's a whole complex relationship. So this diagram up here is a pretty popular one. If you ever Google the soil food web, this image will likely come up. And it's a representation of some of the different primary species. There's a lot more living things than just this in soil, but this simplifies it. You have in soil, you have your parent material, which is the rock and the earth that is being broken down and turning into new soil all the time. Like if you've ever seen a tree growing out of the side of a mountain, like a rock, and you're like, how the hell is that even happening? It's like, there's no soil there. It's just it's rocks, Roots will make their way in, they'll break rocks open, and then the biology, the microbes, will start to decompose that rock and turn it into soil over time. So that's how we've gotten our soils that we have today, is through natural erosion and breakdown processes, and also the decomposing of organic matter. So think of a tree and how it loses its leaves every fall. All those leaves fall onto the ground and they decompose, becoming the food for all of the life. This web of life is going to help break down that organic matter, and it's going to become new soil and new nutrition for the tree in the next year, and all the other plants too. So anyway, why this is important is because we are advocating for a method of growing that does not involve fertilizer. And a lot of people, whether you're a gardener or a full-blown farmer for a living, you might be used to relying on these types of products. So We're here to say that if you take a look outside, it's not raining fertilizer, yet the forest is growing pretty well without any human interference. You know, there's plants everywhere doing their thing, yet we're not out there feeding them. We're not cultivating them ourselves. Where are they getting their nutrition? Well, this is where it's coming from. The soil food web is constantly breaking down organic matter and parent material like rocks and minerals in the soil and incorporating that into their own bodies. It's what they eat, you know? So they lock up nutrition in their own bodies. And when you have a healthy soil food web, what you've got is essentially a checking account or like a bank full of nutrients. Now, when you use fertilizers, especially chemical ones, and also pesticides and herbicides, those things damage the soil food web because they don't know how to live in environments that are high salinity, high salt contents, for example, and most chemical fertilizers are salt-based. They also kind of die off naturally because if you're feeding your plants with soluble nutrition that's available for direct uptake into the plant has no reason to interface with the biology that lives in the soil, which is normally how it gets its nutrition, right? Plants do photosynthesis, and photosynthesis, the byproduct of it is carbohydrates. So the plant is making sugars and proteins, carbohydrates, and about half of those carbohydrates, it's a fascinating fact here, about half of those are going into the soil. Like the plant makes way more than it needs when it does photosynthesis. So all of these sugars are being pumped literally out of the roots, and they're going into the soil to feed this. So all of the microorganisms are getting most of their carbohydrates from the plant root exudates. So the exudate is the term for the carbohydrate liquid sugar that the plant seeps into the soil. And when a living plant sprouts and germinates and starts to put its roots out, there might not be a lot of microbiology at first, but as that plant grows its roots and starts to release these sugars into the soil, you see an explosion of microbiology start to happen around those roots.
Because they're attracted to the sugar. That's what they're coming for, those easy carbohydrates.
Yes.
You have a question back there?
So if you were to go out in one of these fields, dig a hole, are you going to pull up living soil?
Yes.
Just maybe not as living as we think of it.
Well, the fields here, these guys farm in a very responsible and natural way. They're not dumping pesticides and herbicides. They're not, disturbing the soil too much mechanically with tillage and things like that. So if you were to dig a hole here, the soil that you would find would be very alive.
Okay, let me take it back.
Yeah.
Dig a hole anywhere.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
in your backyard,
Yeah.
say? Sure.
Yeah.
Very much.
If
What's the difference between that living soil and something that we're going to put together?
So, can I take this?
Go ahead.
So, two things. We're dialing it in to make it the best for our plants, right? We're making it sure that our plants are getting exactly what they need. Also, a lot of us are growing indoors or in pots, and we're not necessarily using the living soil that's in our yards and in our fields. And so this is an opportunity to build the thing closest to nature inside your pot, so that they're getting all of that benefit.
Yeah, and some options, we're going to talk about multiple different ways to build soil blends today. Sometimes indoor growers don't have the option to use a super heavy soil mix, for example, and regular soils are very heavy versus potting mixes, like a lot of reasons why greenhouses and indoor grows use things like peat moss or coconut coir as a medium, which those are what's called a soil-less medium, because there's not any, those are inert, and they basically serve as a medium for plant root support. Like it gives the roots something to grow into, but then all of the nutrition is going to be received through your fertilizer feed, right? And that's the standard way of growing in most greenhouses, and even in regular field agriculture for broadacre crops. Like, a lot of times what we're doing is farmers are going out and they're tilling up their soil. They're mixing it all up with a disc or some other kind of farm plow implement like that. And then they're nuking it with herbicides, like Roundup is a very common one. And that will kill basically all plants except for GMO Roundup ready corn, for example, or soybeans, right? So how is it killing those plants? Well, it's taking away all of their nutrition. It's actually, glyphosate binds with a lot of things in the soil, and it just locks up a lot of nutrition. And I don't understand all the mechanisms on how glyphosate works, but I do know that it absolutely destroys the life in your soil, and makes a lot of nutrition, such as like phosphorus, which there's plenty of in our soils, but it's very hard to access sometimes because of the way we farm. It's locked up in chelates with things like herbicides, or it's just locked up, in something other than the soil food web, such that it's not really very available to your plants. What was I don't even remember where I was going with that, but I'll go on tangents a lot today. Anyway, what we want you to understand here, though, is that there's a big difference between feeding a product that's made somewhere in a laboratory or whatever, that is already made to be bioavailable for plant uptake. Like when you guys mix up a reservoir of fertilizer, say liquid nutrients, right? And you pour that into your medium, your growing medium, that nutrition is in soluble form, and it's in the molecules are in a structure and arrangement that is available for the plant to just suck it right up right away. Okay. That's great when you need like quick response, to something, like you want to have real tight control over something. However, what it does is it bypasses this. So the plants don't need to produce those sugars, and they don't need to actually have any kind of symbiotic relationship with the microbial life, because they're just getting mainlined, spoon-fed their nutrition. They don't need to do anything for it. So a lot of people will argue for the case of using fertilizers, and they'll say, well, an ion of nitrogen is an ion of nitrogen. Like, doesn't matter whether it's synthetic or organic. However, we'll talk about a lot of the reasons why it really does make a difference. And
I would not want to get all of my nutrients in an IV. I like eating a balanced variety of food, and so do our plants.
Yeah. Imagine, and this is why, just to touch on this real quick, this is a lot of the reason why we farm the way we do is because it produces huge yields. And that's what farmers get paid on, right? If you're growing apples, you're going to get paid by the bushel, by weight of apples, of corn, whatever it is. And cannabis is no different. We get paid by the eighth, the ounce, the pound, right? So the more that you grow, the more money you can potentially make. And synthetic fertilizers in general, produce large plants, and they produce plants that grow very quickly. Similar to, imagine you're a human being and you're like, I'm going to get all my nutrition by hooking myself up to an IV of McDonald's or, fast food. And I make this comparison because the fertilizers that we can buy are basically like fast food for plants in terms of the quality of that nutrition. It's very simple and highly processed, just like fast food is for us. So what would happen if you, as a human being, hooked yourself up to a main line of fast food?
Yes, and you also grow really fast, which is exciting, right? It's exciting to have big, fast-growing plants that look awesome. We get excited about it, but it's not a healthy plant.
You won't grow healthy muscle and tissue. You'll grow a whole bunch of fat and you'll be unhealthy. You'll be huge. If you were a crop, you might make your farmer a lot of money. But that's not exactly what we're after. We're after quality first, and then we want to focus on how do we get the most quantity.
Making a distinction between like organic chemical fertilizers
Mhm.
and just organic fertilizers like mulch, compost, like that.
Yes. Yeah. So
So how much when you're using a fertilizer, not organic, I mean
Not chemical.
mhm.
not chemical, right, not inorganic, is feeding the plants and how much is feeding the microbiome?
Yeah, great
Which is more
question.
important?
We actually are going to talk about mulching later in this, but that's a good question.
Mhm.
Exactly how much is for the plant, how much is for the soil food web. And I don't want to say that it doesn't matter. It does, but it's both that are important to us. We
Yeah.
want to have a healthy soil food web and a healthy plant. We want both.
Yeah, but
Okay, I just wondered if you were saying otherwise.
yes. Well, I'll say this much though. In the most mature ecosystems on our planet, think of a old growth forest like the redwoods in California or something like that. Those ecosystems are 100% biologically fed their nutrition. And there are many ecosystems on the planet where nutrition versus being uptaken chemically, what I mean by chemically is the chemistry, not like a chemical, but chemistry, right? Because one way plants absorb nutrients is from soluble ions in solution. So the water that's in your soil, stuff will dissolve in it and it'll be in forms that can go into the plant roots. And that has to do with chemistry, like how opposites attract, right? So if you have a negatively charged ion, which is called an anion, you can exchange an anion for a positively charged, what's called a cation. And your roots are doing this naturally to uptake nutrition in the soluble form. However, what I'm saying is that in advanced ecosystems like a redwood forest, 100% of the nutrition is biologically delivered. Very little of it is solubilized and chemically uptaken through the exchange of ions. Most of it is getting into the plant directly through microbes putting it there. And we'll talk about some of the ways that that happens, but it's absolutely fascinating. And science does not understand it yet. Like, we don't even understand how processes like photosynthesis work completely. There's so much mystery still left. And that's another reason why we advocate for partnering with nature to cultivate rather than trying to act like we've figured it out. There's so much that we don't understand about how plants grow and what makes them healthy, that we think just using good soil and water and then trusting the plant and the food web to do what it naturally does is going to produce results that we cannot replicate by using fertilizer, right? And especially when it comes to a crop like cannabis, we want the highest quality we possibly can get. And there's connoisseur level people, who are just super, it's like wine and beer, craft wine, craft beer. People get really into it. And if you're doing this for business or even just because you yourself are a connoisseur of fine grade cannabis, you're not going to be
really good medicine for yourself too.
Yeah.
That way too.
Yeah.
It's not even just about the experience, taste, and all of those things. If you want good medicine for your body, keep going.
Yeah.
I interrupt you.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely right though. It's, some people use this plant as medicine. So to have the cleanest, purest, and the most efficacious, like with the best effects, medicine that you can get, there are complex things going on in the soil food web between plants and the life in the soil that we don't know about. We don't understand it. There's a lot of science that gives us a good glimpse into it, but half of it's a mystery still. So, we just noticed that when we trust nature to do the work, the product comes out completely different. And if you guys want to check out any of it, we do have some actual cannabis over here that was grown this way. And, You can look at it, smell it. You can get some from us if you want, and try it out for yourselves. The effect is completely different than you get from a chemically or artificially grown plant. So if you think about it, like say you're growing with fertilizer and you've got this brand of fertilizer that you use, and maybe you mix a few things in there with it. But you've created a box that now this is the meal that your plant is getting every day, right? And it's very one-dimensional and very simple. Your plant doesn't get to express its true genetic, like actual authentic expression of its genes when it's only eating. It would be like us if all we ate every day was steak and potatoes and that was our whole diet, never had anything else but that, right? So there's complexities. There's things that are happening that we don't understand. And that's the whole point of this, is that the soil we're going to talk about how to build today is meant to maximize this so that there is the most amount of, and the most diversity of cycling of the nutrients, because they're always living, dying, pooping, peeing, all that, right? Like the more sources they can be taking their foods from, and the more different diversity of species that are in there doing all that, the more variety your plant has. So you're taking the box from here with your one formula of nutrients to basically way out here with hundreds of thousands of species and all sorts of different stuff happening in there, that really gives your cannabis or your food the complexity and the nutrient density. That's a very important thing. If you're growing food.
Yeah, you're growing vegetables. You want nutrient dense vegetables, right?
Yeah. So. I don't know if you guys know this, but like today our crops have less than half of the nutrient density that they did about, I don't know how many years ago, before the agricultural revolution of modern agriculture.
From the 50s, right? As compared to that.
Is that the stat? Yeah. But I mean, 100 years for sure. Go back 100 years. The corn and the wheat and all of the crops that we were growing back then had twice as the amount of nutrient density as our food does today, and that's a real issue. You know, it's malnutrition has a huge impact on our health. So, yes.
When you talk about those things in nutrient density, also it makes me recall some things that I've read about the sugar content of the plants themselves. The upper, not there's the interplay beneath the ground.
Yeah.
But above the ground, sugar content has a big effect on what pests, insect pests in particular.
Huge.
What will attack it,
Absolutely.
at what sugar level, and what other insects attack at another sugar level.
Yep.
And so, do you have any information about how to produce that sugar level?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, we do. Yeah, and what they call that is the bricks content. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as that.
You get a psychometer or whatever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Test it.
Use it making beer.
I've got
Yep.
one, but I haven't used it yet.
Yeah. And you know, when we're growing our cannabis, we're very focused on measuring things like this. We actually sap test. We send leaves to the lab every 2 weeks at minimum, and the lab comes back and they tell us not only what the sugar content is and what our bricks level is reading at, but they tell us all of the other things that are present in the plant sap as well. What forms of nitrogen we have and how much of it, how much calcium, how much magnesium, all of the different things inside the plant. You can test your plants to find out how much is getting in there, right? And it's very important for pest and disease resistance as well as a number of other things.
As well
So,
as your soil too, right, Aaron? Testing your soil and
We are going to talk about,
the
yeah.
leaves, and then seeing the difference between the two as far as uptake.
yeah. Yep. And we'll get into that in the management
I
portion.
know we haven't even gotten into the meat of this, and we're having great conversation. This is a lot of really good review from the stuff that we talked about in the intro class too. So I'm really glad that we had this slide and we're having this conversation because I feel like we're all coming into it now with a better baseline. So
Yeah.
This is good.
Yeah.
This makes me happy.
We're going to dive right into like making the soil, but then we're like, wait, maybe we should go over why we're doing it this way first. And again, the soil food web is it. Our entire goal in the methodology of growing that we are teaching is how do we get this food web to be as robust and diverse as possible in the soil. We want the most and the broadest diversity of microorganisms and other life in the soil. And that's because it's going to, again, cycle the nutrition in a very complex and robust way. So your plant has a wide variety of things to uptake when it wants it. So I think that's enough on that. That's the main takeaway there. But let's start with the texture. So I know somebody mentioned texture. And what texture is what it's made out of. So all soil is made up of 4 components, and that is sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. Now, the sand, silt, and clay portion really just refers to different sizes of mineral particles. So sand is the largest, and everybody knows what sand looks like. Silt is going to be a smaller particle size. And when silt is dry, it probably would like blow away in the wind, like chaff almost. Yeah. And then we have clay, which everybody is also familiar with, I'm sure. Clay is the smallest of the 3 particles, and it tends to stick together when it's wet. It will compact. We have a lot of heavy clay soil in our area around here. So when you're gardening outdoors, one thing that you might run into as an issue is compaction. So when you've got too much clay in your soil, it will tend to get compacted naturally. But the right mix of sand, silt, and clay will give us what is called loam. So right here in the middle of this pyramid is where we want to be. You want to talk about how to read that?
I can try.
Yeah.
So it's like really mathy. So stick with me, guys. If I'm looking at like this point right here, right? You need to go from the bottom 10 to 100 here. So this point goes to 40. So 40% sand. Then we're going to go to 40% silt, right? Because the lower, then 20% clay. It's whatever the lower number is when you follow the points, because you're going from 0 to 100, 0 to 100, 0 to 100. So this point in the loam would be 40,
40,
20. And that equals 100, right?
Yeah.
So that's how you do it. That's how you read that.
Yep.
I figured that out all by myself.
Yeah. So when we're talking about a good loam, somebody mentioned the tilth. I think that was you. Tilth is kind of like synonymous with the loaminess, or the tilth is going to be the feel and the texture of that soil, right? And a good tilth will come about when you have a nice loamy mix of sand, silt, and clay. Now, I've farmed in a whole bunch of different soils. Like the hemp fields that we were running in Colorado were probably over, where is it? We were over here somewhere in the sandy loam. So now what happens is each of these different types of soil will have varying types of drainage, water retention, the things that you guys mentioned earlier, right? When it's more sandy, your drainage is going to increase, which makes sense if you think about it, right? Like water doesn't stick and hold in sand on the beach as well as it does in like a heavier clay silt-based soil. So if you got a sandy loam, you know that, okay, I'm probably going to have really good drainage, but I might not have as good moisture retention in this soil. So this is different when you're outdoors, because outdoors, there's not really much that you can do about this. Like whatever soil you've got is kind of what you've got, unless you're going to try and truck in, semi-loads of new sand or more clay or whatever it is that you're missing to make up that ratio, which is very expensive and prohibitive. You're pretty much stuck with the soil you've got.
In terms of
Yes, outdoors. Now, when we get into the management portion, we'll talk about how you can improve it over time by building new soil on top of it. But for now, suffice it to say that when it comes to texture, you're not going to alter that very much.
And like we said, when you're already working outside, there's already a soil food web that's there. And so it's already comfortable with whatever your texture is. And you can work with that and manage that as opposed to when you're building something indoors.
Yeah.
The question.
Do you guys have a preference of like soil type to remediate in terms of like particle size? Like if you would have to do clay or a silty or sandy soil,
Which one would I pick? Probably more sandy, because I like the drainage, you know?
Repeat that question, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Just for him, sorry.
No.
Just so we can
Aaron,
hear
can
the
you
mic.
repeat?
Oh yeah, you want to get it
Sorry.
on the, yes. So the question is there a preference on a type of soil that you'd like to work with and then build up and sort of improve and remediate over time? And for me, you know, this is something, if you're trying to get into farming or gardening, like when we were looking for property to farm in Colorado, we took this into great consideration. Like we were taking soil samples and, all right, what are we working with here, right? I like sandier mixes. If it's not going to be a perfect balance, sandy is pretty easy to work with because good drainage is important. It's a lot tougher to deal with a heavier clay or silt soil because you're going to have to try and aerate that and improve the drainage as much as you can. There's a lot of ways to do that without necessarily having to till aggressively and disturb the soil a lot. Because when you till, you're gonna disturb the soil food web. Like there's fungal networks in the soil that take years sometimes to establish themselves. And when you disturb the soil, you're breaking those up, and it's kind of like coming in and like clear cutting a forest or something. You know, like all the life that was living in there now, its home got messed with. So it's not going to be the same after you do that. But there's ways to deal with clay soils and silty soils. I think sandy is a lot easier though, just to answer your question, because with sandy, you've got good drainage and then you can just start piling new organic matter on top of it and it will start to break down into a better texture as you go. Now, when you're looking though, say you're looking for a new farm and you're testing your soil, one way to do it is to send it into the lab. But another very simple way to do it is to do this thing called a jar test, where you basically take some water, take a certain amount of soil, put it in a jar, and you shake it up really good and let it sit for 24 hours. And what you'll see is that the different layers will settle out. So when you look at your jar, you can measure the height of each layer to get a rough estimation of how much sand, silt, and clay you've got.
And there are videos on YouTube that show how easy this is. If it's something that you want to do, you can do it pretty easily.
Yeah, just Google that jar test, soil jar test. You'll be able to find out how much soil to put in and what to do like that. And like I said before, like we're talking about building soil for longevity. So when you're thinking about your texture, and this is the design section, right? Like, how are we going to design our texture? Well, ideally, we want a good loam. And also, because we want this to last for many years and be reused, we will also want to avoid ingredients that are going to impact the texture long term. For example, does everybody know what perlite is? Okay. So perlite is like an aeration kind of stone almost, but it's fragile. And perlite breaks down very quickly. And it's also lightweight. And sometimes it will float to the surface. It'll rearrange itself and float to the surface. Then it'll start to break down into a dust and compact. And it will change the texture of your soil over time. So there's certain considerations like that you want to be aware of. If you're building a soil for long-term use, you probably don't want to put perlite in it because eventually that's going to break down and turn into like dust cement, you know? It's not so good. All right, so that's texture. Texture is what it's made up out of, right? Oh, and you know what? I didn't mention, just go back to the slide one more time. Number 5 with the pyramid.
Oh, you were.
I was on it.
Yeah, sorry. Organic matter is the next piece, okay? So we talked about sand, silt, clay. Not all soil has organic matter in it. If it doesn't, it's probably not very fertile, but there are types of plants, like I mentioned a tree growing out the side of a rock. You know, we've seen that. So you don't need a lot of organic matter, but for what we're doing, we definitely want it. Organic matter is the component of soil that contributes to the life. And it's the breaking down and decomposing of that organic matter that fuels your soil food web. So good soil, outdoors or on a farm, is usually going to have at least 3 to 5% organic matter component. Okay. Now, when we have the opportunity to build our own soil from scratch, we can do a lot more than that if we want to. So the mixes that we're going to talk about are going to be very high in organic matter, more like 20 to 30% organic matter. And, you know, because of that, there's going to be a lower percentage of all the other things, but it will still stay in the loam category if we keep the ratios how they are, right? At 40, 40, 20, approximately like that. But that organic matter percentage, very important. It holds a lot of nutrition. It's a home for the soil food web, and the decomposition of it is what feeds the food web. So organic matter is important. If texture is what it's made up out of, structure is how it aggregates together. So what happens once you make your soil blend is that you're going to plant your plants in it, you're going to put your life in there, and it's going to start to rearrange those particles in your soil. And as the life does its work, it's going to start to clump particles together into what we call soil aggregates. If you see the picture here, you've got an individual particle on the left, and then you've got an aggregate, which is a bunch of particles held together. And then over here, we have the structure, which is the overall way that the aggregates and particles are arranged. And what this does is it creates the porosity of your soil. And this is very important because the porosity is where all your water can move in, where the gas exchange can happen, and it's also a home for the biology. Okay? And good structure looks kind of like this. You've got that sort of clumpy, you know, clotted up. If you've ever seen good soil in a garden, like when you pull the roots out of a plant, like the top picture here, you'll see that it's all stuck to the roots. And that's because of what we're going to talk about here in the next slide, which is that life is what creates the structure. So if you make a good soil texture and then you don't have any life in it, the structure of the soil is going to basically stay the same because it's the life that's in the soil that creates soil aggregates and the overall structure of your soil. So you got some examples here. Worms and animals and insects, they're in there moving around. You know, worms are making tunnels through the soil, and that allows water to go through those pores. The animals and insects are moving around and doing their thing in there. Bacteria and fungi both produce sticky kind of gel-like substances. What fungus produces is called glomalin. Mainly mycorrhizal fungi produce that, which is the type of fungi that associate directly with your plant roots. I'll talk more about that in a second. But these biofilms and the sticky sort of gels that the microorganisms produce are what hold soil particles together. So when you have lots of life in your soil is when you're going to get that clumpy, nice cottage cheese texture because it takes the life in the soil to produce that. And then, of course, we have the plant roots. So as they move into the soil, they create their own channels of, you know, aeration. They're pushing particles around and moving through the aggregates. And as plant roots die off, they are going to leave openings in the soil. So when you terminate a cover crop or a companion crop that you're growing along with your crop, or even when you harvest your main crop, one thing that we'll teach you in the maintenance part is not to remove the root ball. Let it decompose in the soil. And not only is that going to feed your soil food web as the microorganisms break it down, but it's going to leave a whole bunch of channels, like an intricate subway system moving through the soil. And that's very good for your structure. So step one, create the right texture, combination of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. Step two, get it inoculated with life so that the structure can start being built. And for that, you're going to need bacteria, fungi, living plants, worms, animals, microarthropods, anything that you can introduce to it. If you're growing inside, you want to actively introduce that. And if you're growing outside, if you're taking care of your garden properly, not using things that will kill the stuff, it's naturally going to move in. You don't have to do that yourself necessarily. So that's how you create the right structure. Yeah. So the next thing that makes good soil is balanced nutrition. It's great to have good texture and structure, but if there's not nutrient content in your soil for your soil food web to cycle, then you're not going to have the nutrition that your plants need to grow. Okay. And like we said, our methods rely on biologically delivered nutrition over chemically delivered. But this balance of nutrients is still very important because instead of feeding the plants, we're feeding the food web first, right? And they need a balanced diet. So what we're going to talk about when we build the soil is how do we balance the mineral nutrition and organic matter nutrition in a way that encourages the most food web growth and development. So the way that you balance your nutrition, if you really want to do it accurately, is you have to test your soils. And we recommend a company called Logan Labs for doing this. There's a lot of labs that you can use, and the universities around here, like Cornell and others, probably there's a lot of ag around here, Geneseo, Morrisville. They probably all have soil labs that can test your soil, but we recommend Logan Labs just because the things that they measure and that come out in their reports are exactly what an agronomist needs to determine the amendments and what is missing and what needs to be added. Okay, so the Logan Lab soil tests are going to give you a number of different results. If you do this is something to take down. If you want to test your soils, what you want to do is go to Logan Labs and get what's called the complete test with extras.
Where are they located?
I think they're in Michigan, right?
Yeah, but it's an online.
No, Ohio.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Expensive?
It's not.
No.
It's not.
Yeah. Okay, so this test right here is $65, which is well worth it. If you can spend $65 and get your soil balanced, that is like gold, it's well worth the cost. So for $65, what this test is, it's called Complete with Extras. It's going to give you actually a few different tests. It's going to give you what they call a standard soil test, or sometimes called a Malic 3 extraction. They use a very strong acid to dissolve the nutrients in your soil, and then they test that to figure out what's in the soil. So your standard test you get, then you're also going to get what's called a saturated paste test. And what they do with that is they add water to your soil sample. And if you send them your own water that you water your garden with, they'll use your water to do it as well, which gives you even more accuracy. And what the saturated paste test does is it measures what goes into solution when water hits your soil. So now you know from the standard test what's in it, and then you know from the saturated paste test what goes into solution when it gets watered, which are both very important things to know. Then it gives you your nitrate and ammonium levels, which are two of the simple forms of nitrogen. It'll also give you total nitrogen. It'll give you your EC, which stands for electrical conductivity. It'll give you this ENR thing, which means estimated nitrogen release.
Put it in your notes.
Yeah. I never really look at ENR, but it's a good thing to have. And if you do what we recommend next, your agronomist may want this information. And then things like these, this stands for cobalt, molybdenum, selenium, silica. These are micronutrients, trace minerals that you'll want to know how much of them you have in your soil. Question?
Do they tell you what form they're in, or do they just give you the element?
For this, they just give you the element. Yeah.
He asked, do they tell you the form?
Yeah. Well, but that's not true. Some of them do. Like on the Malic 3, I wish we should have put an example of a soil test, but if somebody wants to see an example of a Logan Labs test, sweet.
Yeah.
Then we'll show you guys on a break. Come talk to us and we'll show you. But like some of the categories do tell you what form. So like potassium, for example, I think it says it right on the test. It says P2O5. So that's, what's that?
Phosphorus.
Phosphorus says P2O5?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, yeah, P is phosphorus. K is potassium. So obviously that would have, a formula would have K in it. But they'll tell you your phosphorus as P2O5 is, I can't remember what form of phosphorus that is. But some of them they do, some of them they don't. But that's a good question. Very good question, because it matters what form these things are in. And when we get into the maintenance section, we'll talk about how to make sure you've got all the different forms available. Because like, for example, iron is absorbed in its reduced form and usable for the plant in a certain form, meaning it's got a certain number of electrons and, versus other forms of iron, which are readily available in the soil, which are not usable. Like rust is FeO3. So Fe is iron, O is oxygen. It's Fe2O3, I believe, is the formula for rust. And a lot of the iron in the soil is in that form, but that form is not usable for plants. So we have to know, how do we get the right forms of each different nutrient, which is why that's a great question.
Question over here.
Is that why they probably want the water that you use on your garden, because that could have an impact on the form that's.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Totally. That's one of the main reasons. Your water could also have like,
Acid or basic water.
yeah, the pH of it will make a difference as to what goes into
If you're
solution.
using well water versus town water, and if your well is spring fed or if it's not, like that's all going to have an effect.
Right.
Yeah. If you're
Well water, tons of calcium in it.
Sure.
Lime.
hard water, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Most
That
days.
has different
Around here, yeah.
Yeah.
parameters than
Yeah. A lot of the water around here
city.
is hard water.
Sure. And if you're watering, say you're watering your plants indoors with water that's been treated through a softener system in your house, right? You don't think about it, but you do that. And outside you're watering out of the hose, which is coming right from the well. That's two different water samples,
Exactly.
really. So
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, for balancing your nutrition, what we recommend is to test your soil first. And if you get this complete test, what you can do next is very easy, because none of us, including me, are agronomists. I know some about this topic, but there's a lot of very complicated math that goes into determining how you adjust your mineral and nutrient balances in your soil. What amendment to add, because they all interact with each other and stuff too. So like, let's say you're low on calcium and you're like, I'm going to use some gypsum, which is calcium sulfate. Let me take some of this gypsum, and maybe it's like 40% calcium, 20% sulfur, and the rest of it's other things, right? But you got to know what that is, because when you're adding the gypsum, you're not just adding calcium, you're also adding sulfur. So If you already have too much sulfur, maybe you don't want to use gypsum. Maybe you want to use another form like a calcium carbonate, like oyster shells or something like that to get your calcium. All of that knowledge you don't have to know, because it's very easy just to engage an agronomist for something like this, and it's also very cheap. So if you use Logan Labs and you pay $65 for the complete test with extras, you can then pay an additional $30, and Logan Labs has an on-staff agronomist that's like their in-house agronomist, and they'll analyze your test for you and give you recommendations on what amendments to add. So now we're talking about less than $100. You've got a complete assessment of what's in your soil and what you need to do to balance your nutrition in it. There's even one of these ones, the one I listed here called the Soil Doctor tool. This one agronomist goes by the Soil Doctor. And he's great. He's a very good agronomist. And we've used him here personally at Taproot. And he has an online tool where if you don't even want to talk to a human, you can just take your soil test results and plug in the numbers to this online tool that he's got and hit go, pay your $30, and it'll print out a full report that tells you, it's very detailed. There's a lot, and then it's got amendment recommendations in it. And you can buy those amendments straight from the agronomist. A lot of these agronomists, one of the ways they make money is they'll do your assessment for $30, which is real cheap, but they're also hoping you're going to buy all the amendments you need from them after they tell you what they are. So it's convenient for us too, to be able to just grab that stuff straight from whoever gave us the recommendation. Now, if you want to get into learning yourself, that's what this is talking about over here. You can take classes in agronomy. The Soil Doctor actually offers one that I'm considering taking just because it's good to know this stuff. If you do this professionally, to be able to check the work of the recommendations and understand why they're recommending this amendment over another one. And it's just good knowledge to have. It's not necessary, but if you want to learn, there's books like The Intelligent Gardener is all about this. William Albrecht is the scientist who got into this stuff originally. He's dead now, but the balance of minerals that we're going for is commonly referred to as Albrecht balanced, because William Albrecht is credited with coming up with a lot of these ratios of like how much calcium to magnesium you should have in your balance. And he researched these things and determined what effects they have. Now today, the accepted sort of parameters for a good nutrient balance in your soil is commonly referred to as an Albrecht balance, because that's who figured that out.
And his stuff is collected. It's like all just kind of journal articles and papers that are put together in these books, the Albrecht papers. And it's a little less readable than some of the others, but it's very complete. A lot of information.
Yeah, he's like, his papers will be like, the effects of manganese on crop production in corn or something, and it'll talk about manganese and how that particular nutrient interacts with other nutrients and stuff like that. And so his papers are a combination of like a whole bunch of different studies and topics that he did. And you can get a book, like I have one that's called Albrecht on Soil Balancing. And it's just a collection of a bunch of papers that he did. So that's how you can learn, and then YouTube, of course, is always a killer resource. You pretty much find how to do anything on YouTube nowadays. So definitely recommended. Okay, selecting amendments. I already touched on this, but most of them are available through the agronomist that you talk to. You can source them yourself if you know what you're doing. And if you're going to do that, the main things that you want to look for are two things. Number one, are they contaminated with anything you don't want? A lot of times amendments can have heavy metals in them. And if you know about regulated cannabis farming, one of the things that almost every state requires you test for when you produce cannabis is heavy metals, because we don't want people smoking heavy metals. It's really not good for you. So if you've got ingredients, cannabis especially is a bioaccumulator. pulls a lot of stuff. In fact, hemp can be used to remediate like all sorts of crazy like radioactive soils and stuff. It's like it'll just pull it all out and lock it up, you know? So cannabis, if there's heavy metals in your soil, it's going to get into your crop, especially if you're growing weed. So you want to be real careful. Make sure that whatever places you source your amendments from can prove to you with test results that they don't contain heavy metals. And then when you're dealing with organic amendments, like let's say you want to use alfalfa meal as a nitrogen source. Well, where did that come from? Who farmed it? Did they dump pesticides and herbicides all over it? And now you're putting a whole bunch of pesticides and herbicides into your soil. You got to be really careful about that stuff. So knowing the right questions to ask, asking your vendors to provide you with test results that verify these things is a good way to do it. Also, though, if you're buying amendments from agronomists and different companies, a lot of the time they've done that work for you already. So does everyone know what Build a Soil is? Who knows about that website? Cool. So Build a Soil sells a bunch of organic amendments. They're based in Colorado, but they've blown up huge nationally. Build a Soil is an example of a company where they know that their farmers are growing cannabis and are going to be subject to strict testing standards. So they've gone and made sure already that any product they sell is going to be clean and free of the things that could make you fail a test or be unhealthy for your customers. And a lot of times agronomists will have done that work already. Just ask them when you talk to them, like, what's the best source of these amendments? Where and what have you done to verify that they're good?
And you can just, if you're growing fruits and vegetables, and you just tell them like, this is what I'm growing, they're going to work with you about what it means. We talk a lot about cannabis because it's what we're growing, but fruits and vegetables, you don't want heavy metals in those either, and you don't want, you want all of the things to be true. So just when you're on the phone with the agronomist or when you're in the thing, just have conversations. They're gonna want you to have the right things for your plant.
Yeah. Like kelp is one. If you're using kelp, great source of micronutrients and a lot of other things as well. But kelp is known to have high levels of arsenic in it.
Yeah.
So, make sure that you're not
a huge problem for fruit. Fruit picks up those kinds of things out of the soil. I know that fruit gardeners really worry about that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
Is there a kelp brand?
I use Down to Earth sometimes. We don't use a lot of kelp.
he asked what kind of kelp we prefer.
Yeah, the question was, do we have a favorite kelp? Down to Earth makes good stuff in general. They're just a good organic soil amendment company. However, it's pretty expensive. I don't use a lot of kelp, and right now here at Taproot, we're actually building soil for the greenhouse next door. And this is an example of the beds that we're going to be using. Okay. And
During the break, you guys can come take a look at it too.
yeah. Kelp, I don't believe, is one of the amendments that we've chosen to go with, right, Josh? We didn't do any kelp. Yeah. Part.
What was the reasoning behind that?
Thank you. No, we need to repeat them anyway, so they get recorded through the mics and stuff. Yeah, the reason for that is potential contaminants, for one, but also that we can get the same balance using other things, and it can be a little more precise and effective. So, and our agronomist didn't recommend it, you know?
This was a good question too that we were struggling with ourselves, because what we're trying to do is create what do we have locally versus bringing in out of state non-native things to us, right? This is another topic, because as you do that, shipping costs, and then just trying to find some of those resources. So this is a big challenge that we're trying to look into and find alternative ways to find stuff locally as much as possible, and then doesn't do the same kind of thing, right? And it's not always easy to do, but it's worth the challenge because, again, shipping costs the way things are right now is just incredible, and the petroleum that goes into doing that and the cost. what our focus is trying to get as much locally as we possibly can. But some things you just can't find.
Yeah.
Or just, you have to go down that road with getting that. So, you know, that's what our kind of morals are, is trying to source locally as much as possible. But you can't always do that. Like lava rock here just doesn't happen.
No volcanoes.
So it's
No
a challenge.
volcanoes.
Yeah.
There's lots of it in Hawaii
And some
area.
other things like that with, you
Should
know.
be able to get it cheap.
So you have to kind of weigh in what you have and what you can get locally.
And that's, you know, a really good point too, is that we're all growing different amounts of things in different amounts of soil and different climates. We would love to just be like, this is the formula for great soil. Here you go.
Yeah.
But we can't do that, right? Because you're living someplace that's different than where you're living, and you're working in a different space, and you're working with a different amount of light, and nothing is the same, right? From space to space to space, and it's a little bit of figuring it out as you go. It's a little bit of really minding that soil food web and really helping it succeed. And like Josh said, finding things that are local, and there's no perfect formula.
Yeah. Yeah.
How many plants are you growing in that?
Oh, in this bed?
Yeah.
Probably it depends on the variety. It's another answer of it depends, right? But depending on the strain, they all grow differently. So some of them are going to be big and stretchy, and they'll grow real fast, and they'll fill up the canopy space that we want to fill faster than others. So in those, we'll do less plants and space them further apart. But then we've got some plants that grow differently, where they don't branch a lot and they grow very slowly, things like that. If that's the case, for that variety, we'll probably stack them up a lot closer.
On average, what, 6 plants and something like that?
No, probably a lot more.
Okay.
I tend to, especially, and this is a trick for living soil growers, like one of the things that deters people from going with large containers like this, if you're growing cannabis, you might be used to having a flower room and a veg room. And your flower room is always on a 12-hour light cycle. You harvest it, and then the next day or two later, you're going to come in with a whole bunch more new pots. You'll bring your plants in, and they're already vegged up to the size you want them to be when they start flowering. So you move them in, and it's a perpetuated cycle so that you can get as many harvests per year as possible. So on the commercial scale, that's really important as well, because if you can get a whole extra harvest in a year, you're going to make a lot more money that year. So the speed at which you turn over your garden is important. One of the tricks to turning over quickly, if you're using large containers, and like, we're not going to be moving things like that in and out of the grow room. That thing is permanently where it's going, right? So we like to grow in more of a sea of green method. If you've ever heard of that before, is like more plants stacked up a lot closer. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but maybe a topic for another class. But
If you want to know more about it, write it down on your little sheet.
yeah, or come ask me questions about that too, if you want to talk on the break or after the class. But yeah, I like sea of green. It yields more because it's faster. It fills the canopy faster, and it's ready to flower faster. And then it also, younger plants require a lot less. If you're flowering a plant that's this tall when you flip it to flower versus a big freaking, plant that's been alive for 2 months already, if you've got a cutting, you transplant it, veg it for 1 week, and then flip it, number one, you're going to get a lot more cycles in. But also that plant, if you're indoors, it's a great trick for saving energy. Small plants like this, they're going to require like a third the amount of photons to grow. So you can use way less powerful lights, or if you have LEDs that you can dim them down and start to provide way less PAR, photosynthetically active radiation, the number of photons that you're delivering to the leaf every day. That number can be way lower because your plants just don't need as much light. It's a cool trick a lot of people don't know. And they'll still produce the same size buds. Like if you got a bunch of plants that are just like this tall, but every single one of them is just a fat cola, like you're going to yield a lot more than you would with like one big main cola and then a bunch of side branches and lower stuff. sea of green. It's the way. Anyway, back to making soil. Selecting amendments we're done with. Okay. Horizons. This is something that occurs naturally in nature, okay? As soil breaks down and the top layers decompose, they wash down into the lower levels of soil. Soil in nature will set up horizons like this. And I believe that scientifically there's like 12 different soil horizons, but we're not going to talk about all of them because we're only really concerned with the ones where our roots are, which is going to be the top 3 layers, the O horizon, A horizon, and B horizon. When we're building soil, you don't have to do this, but here at Taproot, we've chosen to build a horizontal soil system. So we're actually making an A, B, and O horizon, which are 3 different soil mixes. The B horizon, the subsoil, is going to go at the bottom of these containers, and it's going to be about 6 inches deep, and that's going to be heavy mineral content, right? In nature, that's what your subsoil horizon is anyway, is a lot more minerals and, sand and parent material, things like that. Minerals that have washed down from the upper layers, they'll start to accumulate there above your bedrock layer. So our bottom 6 inches is going to contain almost no organic matter. It's maybe, I shouldn't say almost no, because most of our soil is going to have a lot of organic matter in it, but maybe call it like 10% organic matter in our B horizon. And then our A horizon, which is commonly known as topsoil. This is the main soil that your plant roots are going to grow in, okay? And it's going to be a mix of a lot of organic matter. A lot of it's going to be humus, which what humus is, if you haven't heard that term before, is the furthest level of organic matter, the furthest it can be broken down. Once it can't be broken down any further, it's called humus. And it's usually very high carbon, because most all the other nutrients have been stripped out of it by the life in the food web, and you're left with active carbon that is a good home for microbiology and very, very good, like high humus. Humus is the best kind of organic matter you can have. It just stabilizes everything, and it's excellent for your soil. So the A horizon sometimes will have a lot of humus, because the O horizon above it has more actively breaking down organic matter. And as it breaks down and leaches further in, more of the organic matter that makes it down into your lower horizons is going to be humus. So we're building our second layer. Our A horizon, for example, is going to be 8 inches thick. So we got our subsoil layer for 6 inches, and that's going to give us good drainage, all that mineral sand, and we're going to probably put some rocks in the bottom and stuff too. That's going to create real good drainage out of our beds. And then the next layer of topsoil that we build on top of it is going to have a lot more compost. We add a higher percentage of compost into that layer. And we add a little bit of peat moss too. So we're going to talk about peat moss and coco coir in a minute, what roles those may play in your mix. But as far as a horizontal system goes, we've got a 6-inch subsoil, an 8-inch topsoil layer, and then we're doing another 6 inches of organic matter on top of that. So we're talking about a total depth of 20 inches, and that will leave us, that bed I think is like, Josh would know, I think that bed's like 24 inches tall. It's about 2 feet. And we leave that extra space on top, an extra 4 inches, so that we can mulch. We're just going to pile up mulch on top of there continually and let it be breaking down, because we're going to replenish that organic matter layer as we grow. All the time, we're adding to it more organic matter in the O horizon. So that's what a horizontal system looks like. Before we move,
You say all the time, what specifically do you mean? You don't mean every 2 hours,
no,
every 2 years.
Well-
What kind of a time frame are you talking about when you say all the time?
yeah. To repeat the question, it's what do we mean by all the time? How often are we adding fresh organic matter and mulching? And the answer to that would be, it depends.
What's the range? I'm pretty good at dealing with ranges, you know,
it
I
really
have
depends a lot
to deal
on
with
this.
a range.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for you want to answer?
No, go ahead.
Okay. For you in your outdoor garden, I would say every year at least, maybe twice per year, you're going to want to put down a nice new layer of mulch.
Okay.
Now that also depends, though. You know, you might test your soil and see that there's not as much organic matter as you'd like, and you're going to mulch a little heavier to try and get some of that.
Especially because you're not building the other layers, right? Because if you're working outdoors, you're building onto them, but you're not creating them from nothing. Whereas if we're making things like this, or we're making things in pots inside, we're creating it ourselves. Because you're not creating it from nothing, you're managing it differently than something that doesn't have all that organic material to begin with.
Right, and I'm trying to get away from tilling and go with ripping and rotted manure instead of.
Yeah,
Awesome.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, question first.
Did you guys have a reference of a specific natural horizon system where you picked the ratio before 6:8:6, or did it?
Not exactly. I've worked with a horizontal soil system before on a commercial scale. In fact, the last position I held in Colorado, we were running about 60,000 square feet of greenhouse, all like this. Everything was raised beds, and it was all horizontal soil. And that blend actually had 0 peat moss in it. It was just a sand, silt, clay, organic matter mix. And it was heavier on minerals and sand towards the bottom. And as you go up the horizon layers, it became lighter, more compost heavy, and more heavy on the loamy mix versus like a sand and clay towards the bottom. Yeah.
But one of the things I was going to add is that the soil testing, that's one of the times that comes into play too. If you're soil testing regularly, you're going to know what the composition of your soil is and when you need to add things. So that's just something to consider. So depending on how often you're testing your soil, that'll affect that as well.
Another thing that just came to mind to mention here is your topsoil layer, your O and your A horizon are really like where the action's at. Like we're building a B horizon for drainage mainly, and also for diversity. Like we want to have some regular subsoil in there because like a lot of places, even if they're using raised beds, they'll just make one mix, right? Which is an option, and it's a fine option to just make one mix, and you've got 18 or 20 inches of all one type of soil. It will work great. You know, essentially, you're just making it so that you don't have distinct horizons. But by us having some horizons, we've got more parent material for like longer term breakdown. Because in the organic matter layers and the topsoil layers, that nutrition is going to be quicker release. The soil food web is decomposing stuff and turning it over faster in the top layers, which is what I was going to mention is that your top 4 to 6 inches, coincidentally, because nature knows how to do this stuff, right? That is where most of your nutrition uptake comes from. In fact, I think I've seen numbers that say over 80% of all your nutrition is going to come from your top 4 inches of topsoil. The roots of your plants are different in the topsoil layer, and they're what are called feeder roots. Those are the finer roots that have like little hairs on them and stuff like that. Those feeder roots are up in the topsoil, primarily in the top 4 to 6 inches. So that's where you really want to focus on your nutrient cycling happening, is in the top 4 to 6 inches. Makes sense because if 80% of it's coming from there, you really want to give that the attention. Now your other roots, tap roots when you're growing from seed, or other type of roots that go deeper, they're not going to have as many fine hairs on them and stuff, and they're not going to absorb as much nutrition, but they are critical for finding water. And they're going to bring up a lot of water, and then there will be some mineral breakdown, but really it's going to be your soil food web that goes down into your B horizon and the subsoil layers, like fungus especially, It's really good at mining minerals for things like phosphorus. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that remember your feeder roots and your top 4 to 6 inches, that's where most of your nutrient uptake's happening. Okay. Okay, so section 1 is now complete. We talked about what makes a good soil, right? It's the texture, what it's made up out of, the structure, how it's going to aggregate together, the nutrient balance that's in the soil, and then your soil food web and the life that's there that makes it alive. Those are what are going to make a good soil when you're designing it. And before we move on to making it, do we have any questions about the design? So I just want to be really thorough on this part.
And if you come up with questions later, that's okay too.
Okay, you guys have been asking a lot already,
No pressure.
which is great.
How do those beds drain?
These ones in particular, the bottom's fabric,
Okay.
so we'll just go right through. When you look at the beds, though, you'll notice that the sides are lined with plastic. And that's because in a living soil, we don't want the sides of the pots to be permeable like that. If you guys have grown cannabis in a hydroponic or soilless medium before, you'll know that one of the commonly used things is a fabric pot that has no liner on it. And there's a reason for that, because when you're growing in a soilless medium, those roots will go towards the side of your pot and they'll start to kind of poke out the sides. But as soon as they hit the air, they'll stop growing. And that's what's called air pruning. There's some pots, there's these pots called air pots, if you've ever seen them. Their whole design is designed to air prune your roots, because when the root comes out and it hits the air, it just stops and it kind of is cut off right there. And then all the roots behind it, all the branching of the roots behind it, more energy now goes to those and it branches out more. So if you're feeding liquid nutrients, it's really good to have air pruned roots that are branching all over the place and are thickly packed into your medium because they can absorb. Question, Josh?
Can you also touch base? I mean, when you're watering these, it's a different water than typically with a high fertilizer content. You know, you want to have like a runoff, and you're testing your runoff. This is a little bit different when you say where you're not really flooding it and flushing the whole system. It's really to keep the moisture content happy and the organisms happy. Am I correct on that?
Correct. Yeah. You're going to water, and we'll go over this a little bit more in the management section, but you're going to water in a way that is going to, you want the right moisture content, because the right moisture content is going to encourage the most life in the food web.
And again, we're trying to mimic nature, right? So nature's not too worried about how it's going to drain, because it's happening the way it's supposed to. So
yeah, but like Josh said, if you're, you know, I used to work for a big company called Native Roots in Colorado, and those guys, that was the big 300,000 square foot facility, right? And their standard operating procedure was that if you have a 1 gallon pot, you put 3 gallons of water through that pot every time you water it. And their automated systems were set up to do that. And if you're hand watering, you literally have to sit there and count, right? And they teach you how to do that. They're like, you know, you're going to do 30 seconds in this watering wand, and what that, and they would say, watch for bubbles, you know, because you'll flood the pot, and then there's water sitting on top, and you're adding more, and it's draining through. You're dumping all. It's kind of gross because you're like dumping fertilizer into the drain. But these indoor grow ops, it's really messed up, in my opinion, what they're doing. They're causing tons of pollution, but they're literally dumping fertilizer into the drain, because the way that you grow with those types of containers and that system is you need to flush out all the porosity in the soil. You want full exchange of gas and liquid through every pore of that soil. So they would say, watch for the bubbles to stop. And when there's no more bubbles coming out, air bubbles from the soil, you know that you've fully flushed it through, and your nutrient solution is dialed into a certain, you know, so you want a fully fresh nutrient solution every time. which is totally different than this. This is completely not like that at all. All we're concerned with here is keeping the moisture content consistently where we want it to be. And sometimes, like at the end of our cycle with cannabis, we'll let it dry down a little bit, because that has a lot of different effects.
When you talk about the moisture retention and all that, something that I have been looking at for many years, but I didn't think it was a mature biotechnology, what you want to call it. I think it's kind of adolescent stages now. It's not fully developed. But biochar will make your microbiome, from what I understand, will make your microbiome able to withstand both drought and periods of too much water, flooding.
Yeah.
And I'm just starting it this year, but supposedly that's what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
So it's like a buffer almost.
It is.
If you take a buffer for your acid stomach or whatever, or buffer, it's kind of like a buffer for those kind of conditions.
Yep. And that brings me to a good point here. So since we didn't have any other questions, we'll start talking about making the soil.
And then when we're done talking about making a soil, we are going to take a break. I feel the itchiness happening.
Yeah. So this is one slide. This whole section is this slide. It's very simple. When you're making your soil, first of all, number one thing, make sure you mix it well. Like, people overlook this all the time, and you could do all the rest of it right. You've got your design just perfect. You got your agronomic recommendations, and you know exactly what you need to balance your nutrition. And then you start mixing your ingredients together, and you get lazy, and you're like, oh, I think that's mixed good enough. Let me tell you, when you think it's mixed well enough, mix it again for double the amount of time, and then mix it some more after that. Like, getting it homogenized properly is a lot more difficult than you would think it was. And not everybody has a big soil mixer like we do here. So the farm here, we got like a 5-yard, 6-yard machine that we can just turn that thing on and let it go until everything is very well homogenized. But most of you will not be making soil that way. You'll be using a shovel and your own sweat and elbow grease. And it's very easy to be like, oh, I think that's mixed well enough. It's probably not. Like, no matter how much you think it is, it's probably not, and you can mix it more. And this becomes increasingly important if you're making more than one batch. Okay. So like, we're going to fill up this whole greenhouse full of soil over here. And even with the big soil mixer, we're probably going to have to make like a dozen batches plus, right? We'll put the same ingredients in every time, which is number one important. Like, we want to dose it the same, but then if we don't mix it all consistently, we're going to end up with a situation where we have one bed is doing really great and the other one's all messed up, and we're like, what the heck is going on here? And we don't know. So it's just very, very important to mix it thoroughly.
Have you ever made like bread or muffins or something and you didn't mix it well, and then you end up with like a really baking soda you bite and it tastes gross, and you're like, darn it, what did I do wrong? It's because you just didn't mix it well enough, And it's the same thing with the soil. We don't want one of our beds being baking soda muffin.
Yeah.
Those compost barrel
They can, yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the compost barrel tumbler.
Yes. A compost tumbler could be a very good way to mix some soil up. I will say, avoid the cement mixer. A lot of people, I don't know if anybody's tried this, but you can get those little cement mixers that are like a drum this big, and they're angled, and you can tilt them up and down, and they just kind of spin. I have tried personally myself more than once to mix soil using one of those things, and it does not work. You will not get a homogenized mix. You'll end up needing to stick your arm in there while it's moving, because it all just kind of bulks up in the bottom. Just take my word for it. Don't mess with the cement mixer for mixing soil. You need the equipment for mixing soil that people have, like the ones that we have here at this farm, are very particular. Like they've done a lot of research into how the vessel needs to be shaped and how the things that stir it need to move and everything. So unless you have professional soil mixing equipment, just do it by hand and be extremely thorough, is my advice there. Now to the biochar thing that we were just talking about. Biochar is awesome. It's what biochar is. Who knows what biochar is? Has anyone used it before?
Nearly burned thoroughly wood. It's wood before it turns to ash.
Yes. And the way they do that is through a process called pyrolysis, which is extreme heat and lack of oxygen. So companies that make biochar do it usually in vacuum furnaces where like they can pull a vacuum and then fire that wood, and they'll put whatever type of wood in there. But basically what biochar is carbon. It's basically pure carbon because it's going to burn off everything else. And then the vacuum in that furnace is going to suck out all the gases. Good biochar manufacturers actually use those gases for other things too. But the wood undergoes pyrolysis, and what you're left with is a structured carbon lattice. And that is a very, very stable form of carbon. It's called a passive carbon because it's not going to break down and become part of new life. Like the active carbon in your soil that comes from organic matter breakdown, that's going to become part of a microorganism and eventually part of a new plant. And it gets cycled. So there's a whole carbon cycle, but biochar is what's called passive carbon, and it's very, very stable, and it'll stay in your soil almost forever, and it won't break down. It's also microporous, so it's full of little hidey holes for your microorganisms.
Very scientific.
Yeah.
Kind of anything.
Yeah, little microbe condos.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. So, biochar is awesome. Our soil blend that we're going to be putting together here probably in a week or two, we've got all our components ordered and we're about ready to start mixing, contains 3% biochar. It should be...
Give a recommendation for what size you're going to use?
Yeah. We use small, probably 1/4 inch minus or smaller. And then it's not a bad idea to even go real small. Like you can some of it can be micronized. I wouldn't recommend that all of it is in like a micronized dust form. But if you get like 1/4 inch minus pieces, like the size of small perlite, if you get biochar like that, some of it will be powderized just from moving it around and whatever. But yeah, you probably don't want huge pieces of biochar, but that smaller, like micronized powder all the way up to 1/4 inch minus is probably good. And I wouldn't recommend using really ever more than like 4 or 5% of your total mix to be biochar. The thing with biochar being a pure carbon structure is that a lot of stuff will bind to it, and it's gonna suck up all the nutrition that it comes in contact with. So what this says here, if you're using biochar, be sure to charge it first. What that means is you want to get that biochar in contact with nutrition so that it can...
Before you put it in the soil.
Yes, because you want the exchange sites that hold on to nutrient ions, you want those to have things locked up to them. Because if you put raw biochar into your soil, it's going to suck up all of the stuff it touches. It's going to bind it up, and it's going to bind it up in a very, very strong way that's going to take a lot to unlock it again. So that's one mistake I've seen people make more than once is they'll add biochar, but it's not charged. And then they're like, what the heck? Like my plants are dying. They look terrible. And that's because everything's bound up in the soil. All your nutrients are bound up in the biochar.
How long does it take to charge it?
Not long. You could do it in a day. The way we do it is with compost tea. So we take a compost, we brew a compost tea, and then we just soak the biochar in it or just water it all into the biochar, and it'll absorb all of those nutrients and the microbiology. So when you're charging biochar, the best thing to do it with is like living teas. Compost extracts or teas like that are really great for charging biochar.
When you say 4%, is that like the volume or weight or whatever? You don't even weigh.
By volume.
Volume.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important part, because we messed up not charging it.
Yeah.
And seriously, so it's a critical thing, and it's a very easy thing. You're basically inoculating it with all of the benefits that you want ahead of time. So by not charging it is definitely something that, you know, heard from us, don't do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to charge it, sorry, but don't, you know, it's not just get it and throw it in your soil and go. I just want to point that out.
Exactly. Okay, if you're making horizons like we are, one good thing to do is blend them together. So we've got our 6-inch subsoil layer, but the top inch or two of that, we're going to make sure that we'll add maybe just the first inch of our A horizon on top of the B horizon. And then we'll probably take a tool like a tilther or something, if you've seen one of those. It's a shallow mixing motion where it'll just homogenize the A horizon and the B horizon together, and it's going to make a smooth transition. So it's not, because in nature, it's not like that either. It's not like, here's your A horizon and then boom, hard line, and the B horizon starts. It's kind of like a smooth transition through. So if you're doing horizontal soil making, make sure you blend it together at the junctions. Thirdly, when making soil, and this is another thing I cannot overstate enough, especially with this kind of soil, is use the biggest possible container you can. And this is for a lot of reasons, but trust me, the bigger the container you use, the better results you're going to have in almost every case. The moisture retaining properties of that soil mix improve the bigger the container gets. Think about like my solo cups over here with those little plants in them, right? That plant's not going to get much bigger than that in that container before it starts to become nutrient deficient. There's just not enough in that container to grow a plant that's much bigger.
And we want to have a really dynamic soil food web in there too. So the more space we give that, the better.
Yes.
Right? Like I don't know if any of you follow our Instagram page, but even in those little cups, we have a pretty intricate soil food web in there. Several of them have worms, lots of little critters, lots of roots, fungus, all the things. And we want to give it as much space as it can to help our plant.
Yeah. The smaller the container is, the more volatile and vulnerable really to die off that soil food web is going to be. So the bigger the container you can use, the better you're going to do. Now, a lot of you probably know this, but the size of the plant above the ground is like a mirror to the root structure underneath. So if you've got a plant that's as big as like one of those in the 1 gallon right there, the roots that you could expect to find in that pot are going to be approximately the same size. When that plant starts to get a whole lot bigger than that container, it's going to start getting unhealthy because there's just not enough nutrition for the root zone that it needs to support all that foliage and all that biomass. So the bigger your container is, the more reserves you have, but also, and this is one of the best things about using a big container, is the human margin of error, like for watering, overwatering, and underwatering, is going to be way more forgiving, right? Like that's the number one issue that growers have for cannabis, especially, is overwatering. Usually we overwater more than we underwater, but underwatering can be an issue too. If you've got a big old container and you overwater it, it's kind of like a buffer. You know, you're not going to see a huge problem like if you overwatered a smaller container. The water will disperse itself. If you have good drainage, it may just drain out. So really use as big a soil container as you can. And I understand that not everybody is going to be able to do a huge container. Like if you've got a 4x4 tent like that, I would say use a soil container that's the same size as the floor of that tent. But you're not going to move that, you know, like you're not going to be able to pick that up and move it. If you're going to move that, you're going to have to empty the bed out and and do whatever. So I understand that for convenience, a lot of times smaller containers are easier. However, just know that you will always have better results in the bigger container. Your quality will go up, the ease of growth, the chances of making a mistake, the robustness of your soil food web, all of it's going to be better. So use as big a container as you can. Can't say that enough. So you've mixed your soil. You got the biggest container you can. You've charged your biochar. You blended your layers together. Now it's time to get started. The first thing that you want to do is introduce your life, because that's what's going to create your structure, remember? And that's just what's going to kick off the nutrient cycling in your soil. So the first thing you'll do is, once you got your container filled up, is use your different ways of introducing life, which we'll talk about some more. IMO stands for indigenous microorganisms. We are making that ourselves by collecting the local microorganisms from the forest, from the fields. We put out collection boxes and we culture all the microorganisms. Then we bring them back in and we multiply them out into compost piles and things. And we make what's called IMO out of our wild collections. So if you have good IMO, I talked about this at the last class, so I know a lot of you weren't here. Good IMO is the number one best inoculant that you can possibly have, and that's why we do it. There are hundreds of thousands of microbial species in a homemade IMO, versus there are products that you can buy at a grow store or order them, and they will contain maybe a couple dozen different species. Right? And these are the species, number one, that we've been able to grow in a lab. Not all species can be propagated and grown out and made into a product. So you're only getting the ones that we can actually do like that. And then you're only getting the ones that the company has chosen to include because they think it's important. And what we recommend is using both, because especially if you're growing a very high value crop like cannabis, we want to make damn sure that every type of microbe that we want to be in there is in there. So one of the harder ones to get is mycorrhizal fungi. Even though our IMO has hundreds of thousands of different species in it, mycorrhizal fungi are host obligate, meaning that they need to have the host plant. The roots need to be present there. And those spores of the fungi will not even germinate unless they've got the root exudates from their companion plant, from the host plant that they grow with. So we're growing cannabis. We didn't take our IMO from somewhere that there was cannabis. We took it from the forest. We took it from a lot of different places. Now, there's probably mycorrhizal spores in there. However, this is another reason why we recommend buying a product for this, is we can't verify that very easily with our microscope. And a lot of other things we can tell. But mycorrhizal fungi, difficult to identify unless you know how to use different types of dyes and oil microscopy techniques. Then you can see it. But we can't be 100% sure that our IMO contains the mycorrhizal species that we want. So using a mycorrhizal inoculant is really important. And also, when you transplant, those spores need to come in direct contact with your roots in order to germinate. Again, like I was saying, they need the root exudates to wake them up, and then they need to be next to a plant root cell so that when the spore germinates, it can grow right into the root. So that's what mycorrhizal fungi does, is it grows into the roots, and it kind of becomes an extension of your plant's root system. It's connected into your roots, and then it goes out through the soil just like a root system, and sometimes can increase the surface area of your roots hundreds and hundreds of times. So nutrient uptake is highly dependent in nature on mycorrhizal fungi. In fact, almost all species of plants do associate with mycorrhizal fungi, and they have that relationship. So making sure that we have that in our homemade soil mix is super, super important.
It's the difference between trying to fight a fire yourself with a bucket of water in a pond and having a bucket brigade, right? That mycorrhizal fungi is your bucket brigade.
Yeah. And in particular, phosphorus. Yeah. I'll get to you in 1 second.
Well, wait.
Yep.
Okay.
I just want to touch on it. It's something about the soil food web a lot of people might not know is phosphorus is almost entirely delivered by mycorrhizal fungi. Like all the phosphorus that you're going to get in living soil is probably going to come from mycorrhizal fungi going out into the soil, secreting enzymes to break down mineral deposits of phosphorus, and then intaking that into their fungal bodies and transporting it back directly into the plant roots. This is the main lining of nutrition, like we talked about before with fast food versus others. The food web is mainlining its own nutrition in for us, except for that nutrition is way higher quality and it's delivered on an as needed basis versus every day at 8 o'clock, your plant gets this much phosphorus. You know, this is the plant needs just the tiniest little bit and it's communicating with the soil and with all of the microbes in it that it has relationships with. They've actually done studies on this, which show the response time from a plant releasing an exudate into the ground that corresponds with a specific microbe and the uptake of nutrition back from that microbe. It's like milliseconds. The plant is like, it's signaling at the speed of light for nutrients that it wants. And it's taking what it wants when it wants in a very intricate and diverse way, which we can't replicate. So go ahead with yours first.
Yeah, I was just a little bit confused. You go out in the woods and fields and swamps or whatever and grab your bacteria. It's all over. Get your 50,000, 200,000 species. What you're implying is you plate that out in a lab or something and just select certain ones of those 200,000. Maybe you grab 10, 20, 50 or something, and that's what goes into your...
No, actually.
Yeah, the opposite of that.
Yeah. So I'll describe the process real quick.
Okay.
We got
You
to...
can totally do an IMO class, though. Write that on your little paper.
Yeah, if you guys want to learn IMO, it is...
Very interesting in the first class.
Yeah. IMO is like the backbone of everything we do. It is the foundation of what we're doing. And the way we do it is we've got cedar boxes because cedar is antimicrobial, okay? We build these little cedar boxes and they've got slats in the bottom and holes in the sides to create airflow and allow microbes to move in. Josh is getting an example right now.
Right here.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
really simple. Cedar, because it's
Right.
antimicrobial. And then rice
Yep.
is the capture
Right,
material
okay.
on the bottom. And so whatever this is touching kind of goes and grows up through the bottom. And then obviously you want to kind of cover this just so other animals don't get into it
Right.
and ruin all what you're trying to capture. But
That's how you get the parent.
this is what we're trying to capture all those organisms with.
Okay,
So
now, when you're gonna turn that into something that actually goes on a plant.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's a several
There's a
step
transition between
process.
those two processes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So right here, he's talking about IMO 4, which is the fourth step in the process.
Yeah. So that box gets filled with rice and it gets put out in nature and microbes colonize the rice. Yeah, that's IMO 1. IMO 2 is we go out and once that box is at peak microbial activity, we harvest it, we bring it back in, and we mix it with an equal weight of brown sugar. What that does is it puts it into stasis because there's all this life in the rice, and the sugar sucks up all the water. So it's using osmotic pressure to bind up all the water. And when it does that, all of the microbes that were in the rice, they kind of are like, oh crap, this is becoming a desert. You know, we're not going to be able to survive. So the fungus sporulate, they make new spores, and the bacteria and protozoa encyst. They make a cyst around the outside of their body. And these things can survive in outer space. Like they found bacterial cysts and fungal spores that are millions of years old. Like they go into stasis, and this is what's called IMO 2. It's a shelf-stable capture of our collection. And it still has all that diversity of hundreds of thousands of species of fungus and bacteria in it, right? That's IMO 2. Now that sits on our shelf until we want to use it. And what we do with it is we inoculate compost piles with it. So we take and we make a liquid solution with the IMO 2, and that solution has a little bit of nutrients, a little sugar in it. It's got some of that OHN in it, which is an alcohol tincture, and it's antipathogenic. That OHN will kill off any pathogenic bacteria while still allowing the beneficial ones to survive and thrive. And then we manage that compost pile very tightly over the course of about a week to maximize fungal growth. And the reason we do that is because bacteria are everywhere. Bacteria are like the easiest thing to get.
Yeah, I'm full of it.
Yeah.
I'm full of it.
Yeah, bacteria is everywhere, but fungus is hard to get. And fungus in the soil takes a long time to develop. It takes the right conditions, and it takes a long time of not disturbing it. So our whole process of collecting and multiplying out our indigenous microorganisms is all focused on fungus. And the reason why IMO is the most powerful inoculant you can use is, number one, the diversity is greater because we don't isolate like you were talking about. We're not selecting 10 or 20 of them and then those are what go in. We're multiplying all of them, all hundreds of thousands of them out.
And from multiple collections too.
Yeah.
Like from different places. We're trying
Yeah.
to get as much
This-
as possible, right?
Here, give me that thing right there.
Please.
Yes, thank you. This is IMO 3. So, what's that?
It's a thing. You just said.
Yeah. It's a thing. So this is IMO 3. This is an example of our boutique compost pile that we'll put our IMO 2 in. And this is made up of pine shavings, wood chips, crimped oats, and rice bran. 2 carbohydrate sources and 2 carbon sources. This is an ideal home for fungus. Essentially, if you guys have seen how mushroom farmers have substrates that are designed to be good for fungal growth, this is what we've done here. Is IMO 3 is all about getting that fungus to grow a lot. So we manage the pile. All that microbial activity starts to generate heat. But if we let the pile get over 120 degrees, it's going to kill fungal spores and fungal hyphae. So we have to turn the pile every time it gets to 120. We manually will flip that pile around and turn it over. And we're also spreading out all of the spores and stuff that are being made, because as that pile heats up, the fungus that's in here, they're going to sporulate again. And at the center of the pile is where it's the hottest, so we get a concentration of spores through the center of the pile, and then we flip the pile and mix it together to take the heat back down and also to redistribute the spores throughout the pile. And what you get is material like this, which is you can visibly see the fungus all over this stuff. If you guys want to look, we can pass it around.
So that's an ideal situation, but would you have a worthwhile measure of success, I might say, if I just took something like that and put it on my compost pile with my old squash vines and tomatoes and whatever,
Yeah. Yeah, and
am I gonna get probably 80% of what I would if I had a custom mix? You think,
of the,
or is it not worthwhile?
you mean you're talking about applying IMO 2 directly instead of making the compost pile first?
No, make the compost pile, but then put the IMO on it. Say you've got an established compost pile.
Oh,
You
yeah.
want to do it before you put it on the garden.
Yeah, if you already have an established compost pile, you can add a liquid solution of IMO to it. However,
You get the fungus.
yes, the fungus, the reason why we go to IMO 3 first is because we want to encourage the fungal growth. So IMO 3 is going to have, a high concentration of fungus in it. IMO 4, that is the next step in the process. We take that compost and we mix it 50-50 with our soil. So now what you've got is your IMO and then 50% your own soil, and we water in another inoculation of our IMO 2, and then we let it heat up and do that process where it goes to 120 and we turn it and we turn it again. We do that for about a week. And by the time that it's done, we have IMO 4, which is 50% our own soil, but it's going to be caked up with just tons of fungal mycelium. It'll be white and you'll be able to see all the fungus. So this is why I spend so much time talking about IMO, is because this is the biggest shortcut to getting fungal life in your soil of anything you can possibly do. Maybe a close second would be using actual spent mushroom blocks from a mushroom farmer. If you can get that, that's a great mulch. Like spent mushroom blocks is awesome mulch material because it's just full of fungus. However, it's full of one type of fungus. Our IMO is full of freaking a million different kinds of fungus. Not literally, but a lot. You know, dozens and dozens of different species of different fungus. So IMO 4.
Every step is beneficial. Just to go back to what your question was, and adding it to your compost is great. But taking it all the way to IMO 4 is going to give you the most amount of the fungal growth that you want to put
So which that's essentially mixing with soil. So if
Right.
you want to transport that technology to a home vegetable garden,
Mhm.
or even a large scale acres of vegetables, you could take it to the IMO 3 in compost that you've established,
Yep.
spread it like you would manure,
Sure.
and then thinly till it in or rip it in to the first 2 to 4 inches
Yeah.
of the soil. And,
Yeah, as gently as possible though, because we
Right.
don't want to break up the.
Right.
Right.
And that's what ripping is good because it leaves a lot of the original
Yeah.
fungi and everything undisturbed.
Yeah. That would work great. And if you notice here, our plants that we brought with us, they have IMO 3 top dressed on top of them. And that's because we just don't have IMO 4 yet. We haven't gotten to that stage, but we're about to, because all of our ingredients for making our soil here are about to show up. And then we're going to take that and combine it with the IMO 3. So IMO 4, the benefit of IMO 4 is that you've taken that microbial collection and it is now adapted to your own soil. So IMO 4 is going to be a step superior to IMO 3 because it's got, those microbes are already used to your soil. They're already in it. So when you top dress it, when you incorporate it, or when you make a compost tea out of it, which we'll talk about doing as well, you get an inoculum that is ideal for your soil. It's custom. Not only are the microbes already living in our local environment, they're used to our temperatures and our humidity levels, our barometric pressures. They're already alive and thriving here. And now we've introduced them directly to what we're growing in. It's such a powerful inoculant.
What was the compost pile out here that you had all the fungal growing into it?
That's a different one,
Okay.
which we haven't.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. What's up?
Real quick, on the like when you're about to mix it, obviously you want your different levels like pre-moistened to a certain moisture content before you mix it. Like you don't want to have the whole thing put together and then try and water it in to get it. So what do you suggest as far as moisture content before you start mixing? Like
The soil or the IMO?
the soil, going back to like the third step, like when you're gonna put
Yeah.
everything together, you don't want all your different layers dry. You want to probably have them
Well, you probably do actually.
Really?
Yeah, you probably want it dry for mixing, just because that's how you're going to get it
I mean, once they're mixed
homogenized.
together and you're gonna put them into the bed. You still want to kind of dry it, and then
Yeah. But some may have experience with this when you make
So
a
the
potting
question
soil.
was how moist do you want the thick layers of your soil to be when you're mixing them?
Yeah. And the answer is you probably don't want moisture when you're mixing because that'll hinder the mixing. Stuff will clump together and it won't homogenize as well as you'd like it to. However, excuse me, once you get it in there, you want to fully saturate it. You want to make sure that it gets like, you might just want to flush a lot of water through. You want to be careful not to leach out your mineral amendments and stuff that you put in there. But when I make a fresh soil mix and I'm doing smaller containers like that, I'll put them in a tray and let them sit in a tray of water and just suck up with capillary action. I'll let them sit there for almost a day sometimes and just get that soil, because it's probably hydrophobic. If it's dried out, your soil's probably going to reject moisture at first. And that's actually because the encysted bacteria, the cysts on their outside are made of like wax and lipids. So when your soil's really dry and the water doesn't stick to it, it's actually
beads up on the top. You've all seen it happen,
yeah,
right?
That's because the microbes that are on that soil particle are covered in wax, and it's hydrophobic. So what you need to do is wake up the bacteria and get the life going, and then your soil will become able to hold moisture again. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. And then, so we're going to take a break in a minute, but before we do that, I just want to touch on the last few. You can also add worms, nematodes, and it's a good idea if you can start with cover crops, because you just made a new soil blend. If you plant like a bunch of cover crops in it first, it's a nice test. You get to watch and see, like, is this soil working? Plus it gets the life going before you plant your main crop in it. And having a diverse amount of different types of roots in your soil produces different types of root exudates, which then allows your microbial food web to be more diverse as well. Because each different type of plant, let's say you're growing buckwheat, oats, rye, and clover for a cover crop blend, okay? Well, each one of those different types of plants produces different types of carbohydrates, which it leaches into the soil. So your microbes are going to be different types of microbes that are attracted to each individual plant's root exudate profile. So when you start up a new soil, I always encourage people to plant 4 or 5 different things in it at once, just to get a diversity of life going right off the bat. And then worms, of course, you can buy them online and add them in. You probably want red wigglers. I didn't put this on there, but red wigglers are the type of worms that you want to put in your soil. And they will then multiply and they'll be there forever. So you only have to do worms one time. Question?
Are you going to add red wigglers to that?
Yes.
Now, will you also put in Canadian night crawlers to still travel down into the 18 inches depth of the soil to add aeration?
We could. We probably won't, but we could. The question is, are we going to use African night crawlers in addition to red wigglers? Well, the red wigglers are composting worms, and they stay near the surface. So the red wigglers are going to be up in our O horizon, breaking down organic matter, and they'll stay near the topsoil and keep that. Because like I said, 80% of it is happening in that topsoil. So you want to really focus on that, which is why we choose red wigglers. African night crawlers are a different type of worm, and they go deeper. So a lot of people will use both. We'll probably just use red wigglers because, I've done both and I haven't really noticed any difference in results. And, they do what? Oh, cool. I didn't know that. He said red wigglers handle heat better. It's a fact I did not know, but it makes sense because they're near the topsoil, right? They're up on the surface where the soil's warmer. All right. Unless we have any other questions, we're going to take a 20-minute break.
One quick one.
One quick.
Go ahead.
How big an area? When you say you're getting the local microbes, I mean, you're not talking about just a quarter mile around here. You're probably
Right.
talking Portland, Oswego,
Yep.
Conneaut, Butte County.
This IMO that we passed around has 19 different collections in it. It has 19 different IMO2 collections. I'd say 6 to 10 of them came from this farm, this property in various places. We've got another 6 or 7 from the Pompey area, some from Lafayette, just wherever.
That's what I would expect. I just
Yeah. Yeah, but that's a great question.
Higher altitude certainly helps. If you look at, Sherpas who are going up into high altitudes, when they go down to sea level, it's like they can, you know,
Right.
they're like superhumans at that point. But it's really hard to go from sea level into altitude.
True.
So,
Like in
you
Cortland
know, you'll
County
see better results with higher elevations. They tend to be a little bit just stronger organisms. So it's nice to have a really good mix of those organisms and as diverse as you possibly can. Some near swampy areas, some out in our fields, some right into heavily wooded areas that you're going to see fungal growth happening naturally, and those kind of things. So as far diversity as you can get, the better off you're going to be.
So when you put it into your location, they'll select the correct ones for its location, the rest will die off.
You really want to create the highest potential for as much organisms as possible. Some will not thrive
That's
in your area and they'll die, right? And there are products out there that Aaron will probably talk to, EM1, which is kind of like a man-made product that has only a couple of these things in it. And really, it might work for where they were created, but not necessarily here. Some of them might, but not all of them. So it's kind of this is a better way of balancing all the organisms together, I think.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are you good?
Better.
Everybody feeling okay? Ready to keep going? Okay. I
Okay.
see some smiles. I see some apprehension, so I wasn't sure.
All right.
Ready for the next one?
So cool. Yeah. So we made our soil.
Oh, did you guys come up with any other questions during the break that you want to cover? Anything that came up from before? I just don't want to move forward if you're not ready.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to go into more discussion about nematodes?
Oh, come on. There's no such thing.
Oh man.
Will you let him know that there's actually a thing called nematodes?
Oh yeah. They're important too.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that because the next step in the logical sequence of events is this slide as well. So we talked about you got your soil mix, you filled your container, and the first thing you want to do is put life in it. A good mix of cover crops is going to be great because you can kickstart a whole bunch of different root exudates going into the soil, which will support a wide variety of biological life in the soil. But as we said, that the inoculation of the life itself is so important that we're going to recommend using products and IMO if possible. Let's see. An example that we gave here, and this is what we do once we're going, is that we'll top dress our IMO first. So the IMO 4 goes on top, just like you've seen on our plants over here. And then we make a compost tea with the IMO that we call liquid IMO, or LIMO for short. So if you start getting into the KNF circles, you'll hear people talking about LIMO all the time. LIMO is liquid IMO. It's just a compost tea brewed with the IMO 4. And we will start right at the beginning, watering it in and foliar spraying everything with it. In fact, the procedures at the farms that I've worked on have been that you drench everything. We make our LIMO and then we're just spraying everything with it. It's all over the floor. It's on the walls. It's like on the beds, on the plants. And if you do that once every couple of weeks, you're going to continue to just re-inoculate that IMO into your soil every couple of weeks. So this comes in handy when, like, say the end of your cycle, you do your dry down, and a lot of the microbial life will die when you let the soil get real dry. So to reinvigorate that, it's great to come back through with a liquid IMO to get things going again. When you do your mycorrhizal dip, it's important, like I said, to make sure the plant roots come in direct contact with the spores. So if you got a mycorrhizal powder inoculant, you want to do that at transplant by either putting it into the transplant hole or your furrow if you're outside gardening. Or if you want to individually take each cutting and dip the roots into the powder or sprinkle the powder onto the roots, that's how you're going to do that. That's going to ensure that the spores germinate and create that association with the roots that you want. Now, when you pick an inoculant product, this is an important thing to know because there's a ton of products out there. Some are very simple and they just contain a couple strains of mycorrhizal fungi. For example, the products from Extreme Gardening. If you guys have seen the Mycos and Azos and stuff like that from Extreme Gardening, those are just one or two different species of fungus or bacteria. Yeah, it's a lot of carrier, a lot of filler material in there. Those are okay. You'll get the fungus that you're looking for if you buy the right product. But you want to make sure, number one, that the spores are viable and that the total colony forming units listed on the packaging is accurate. So some companies have a good reputation for this. They've been third-party tested by gardeners and independent laboratories to show that, like, hey, this product actually does contain the live spores and the actual amount of colony forming units that it claims to. Some of them make claims and then you use it and it doesn't have it, or all the spores and microbial bacterial cysts and stuff are dead. Now, these products, all of them are coming from the same places. There's like only a few different labs around the country that are making Glomus intraradices fungus, for example, or Rhizophagus irregularis is another name for the mycorrhizal fungi that colonize cannabis roots, for one, as well as a lot of other plants. But some labs will do a better job preserving that than others. But for the most part, they're all coming from the same places. So what you want to do is try and get as close to the source as possible. Pick products that are coming either straight from these laboratories that are making them themselves, or go with companies that have a good reputation. One of them that I can recommend for you that's available on Build-A-Soil, and I recommend it just because I've used it a lot with good success, is called Rootwise. The Rootwise inoculants are awesome. You know how they have the biggest pumpkin growing competition every year? Well, the guy who's got the Guinness Book of World Records for growing the biggest pumpkins in the world, he started using the Rootwise inoculants this year, and he broke his own record. So these inoculants really, really work, and they're getting some free advertisement from me right now. But they deserve it. They're a good company. And one of the things about their product, too, is that it's what we call a stack of microorganisms. They've put in some of the most important ones that are proven to interface with your plant. But then there's not just those few species in there. They've also added additional species that, while they don't directly interface with your plant necessarily, they support the growth and healthy life of the other ones that do. So the best microbial inoculant products are the ones that have a stack of different microorganisms that are proven to work together well to wake them up and start them doing what they need to do. And the Rootwise line even has an enzyme catalyst as well. So you can buy their enzyme elixir and you use that to wake everything up. And those catalyst enzymes that start the microbes doing their processes are going to get everything cycling real fast. So Rootwise is a good product. After you've got the life in, what you want to start doing probably right away is monitoring your soil food web. And there's a couple different ways to do that. One of them is right here, the microscope. And we can show you guys some of that later, maybe, if anyone.
That was cool. That was really cool.
Yeah, last class we had the microscope fired up and we had some samples on it. And we actually got to see some nematodes moving around in the soil. We saw a bunch of bacteria and fungus, and it was really cool. People always love the microscope. So knowing and learning microscopy, you can take a class like I did to learn that. But there's also tons of resources online, YouTube and stuff. But learning to use a microscope is a great thing to have, because anytime you want to check on your food web, you can just pull a little sample of soil, put it in a test tube and shake it with water, and then take a drop out and slide mount it. And then you can look and see, do I have fungus in here? Do I actually have, a lot of protozoa? Those are the things, those are your two main things that you want to look for, is beneficial fungi and a lot of protozoa, because bacteria and fungi, they lock up the nutrients as they mine them from the soil, but your protozoa are the ones that release it because they graze on the bacteria and fungi. They're the predators. And you could think of the bacteria and fungi as like sacks of fertilizer. They're your bank of nutrients. And when you've got a good, healthy bacterial and fungal population, the protozoa will naturally start to show up as their predators, and they will consume these microbes, which then they will not use everything, right? So there's a lot of waste that happens when they graze on the lower species, and that waste gets released into solution where it's plant available, but also just is getting cycled through the different forms of bacteria, which are interfacing directly and indirectly with your plant roots. The other way to test your soil food web is to send it to a lab. So again, you can do that. That costs money, and you might not want to do that all the time. But a third option is this thing that's called a microbiometer, which is a really cool newer product. And they'll send you a little kit where you can make up a solution and test it. You put it on like this little card, and then it's a phone app where you use your phone app to scan this card, and it will analyze things like your fungal to bacterial biomass ratios. Have you got one?
Got one right
Dude, I didn't know you had one.
Yep.
That's awesome.
I've got a whole supply of. So I don't know if you guys want to look at that. It's really easy, simple, cheap.
Yeah. So that'll tell you how much biomass of microorganisms you have in your soil. And it'll also tell you how much of it's fungus versus bacteria, which is important. For depending on what kind of plant you're growing, different plants like different ratios. So like brassicas, for example, those like higher bacterial numbers in the soil than fungus. However, when you get up into shrubs and things like cannabis, like the larger plants, they start to go more towards the fungal preference. So, and then all the way up to the mature ecosystems, like an old growth forest. Old growth forests are very, very fungally dominant. They are going to be 100-to-1 fungal to bacterial or more sometimes. So larger trees and things like that, basically the bigger and more advanced the ecosystem gets, the more it prefers fungus. And, so knowing what you're growing and knowing what ratio of those things that it likes is important. And you can monitor that with a tool like this, or using a microscope, or sending it to a lab.
So, I'm sorry. So you're suggesting that we probably don't want to go to a high bacteria,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. If you're growing cannabis, yes.
Yeah. So that means that when we're going out looking for IMO 1, we don't want to do it in a forest.
Exactly. No, you do want to do it in a forest.
That's going to be high bacteria, though.
No, opposite.
Oh,
A forest is more fungal.
Okay.
Yeah. So think ecosystem advancement, succession is the word I'm looking for. Like,
Put a rotten log and it tells you right away.
exactly. You'll see it. And that's what you're going to look for is you want to see the visible mycelium, the actual fungus. If you can see it with your naked eye, it's probably beneficial. And that's because the diameter, the width, and the way, how big they are, pathogenic fungi are usually not visible unless you put it under a microscope. But if you can see fungal growth with your naked eye, that's going to be a good place to put your IMO box. And the more fungus you see, the better. Because when we're growing things like cannabis, like I said earlier, bacteria is everywhere. If you do nothing, your soil will be completely bacterially dominant, which could be fine if you're growing broccoli. You might be cool with that. But if you're growing something that wants more fungus, you got to take some real steps to get it in there. So that's when you would look for it actively and then use IMO the way we do to propagate the fungus specifically. Another question?
Yeah, we call that symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the root hairs and whatnot, and the sugar to mineral exchange, you know. So you mentioned the amoeba and whatnot. Is it actually an exchange between the bacteria and the roots, or is it the exchange between the bacteria that have been digested by the amoeba to release what's there to the roots?
Both.
Yeah.
Both?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
both.
It's all so complicated, and that's why it's a web, right? Because
Right.
the plant is able to get nutrients so many different ways when all of those things are available.
One topic that we touched on in the first class was called the rhizophagy cycle. And this is fascinating. I'll give it as an example here. The plant, this is something we didn't know about until recently either. Like the last decade, we discovered this. Plant roots are actually continually absorbing whole microbes, primarily bacterias, and the growing root tips will engulf new microorganisms. They'll engulf living microorganisms whole. And then once the microbe is inside the root cell structure, the plant releases a superoxide which dissolves the membrane. So the cell membrane of the bacteria gets dissolved right off of it, and it is now a naked protoplast inside the root cell, which the plant can pull any of the nutrition out of the bacteria that it wants to. And so it's doing this all the time. And it's not, well, they might be actually. That's an interesting question. There's a whole book on it from Jeff Lowenfels that we sell. Yeah, it's called Teaming with Bacteria, and I don't know if we have that one here.
Today.
Oh, I saw
Yeah.
the fungus one.
Yeah.
Bacteria.
We do have a connection with the publisher, and we are going to be offering the entire series of books by Jeff.
Okay.
We just only have 2 currently.
The whole series is worth your time.
Yeah.
It's
It's
like,
Hit us up
fantastic.
Next week, and we'll have all 4.
Yeah. They're easy to read, though. He's one of the best authors at making this accessible to lay people and to people who, aren't scientists. So anyway, the rhizophagy cycle is a great example of how plants absorb nutrients directly from microorganisms. Mycorrhizal fungi is another. It's a direct absorption straight from the biology. But in the rhizophagy cycle, it's fascinating because this naked protoplast that's being cycled around and nutrients taken from it does not die in many cases. It lives. Yeah, and then the plant, the root hairs, we found that bacteria are critical to root hair growth and development, and the plant will actually spit these bacteria back out the tips of their root hairs. And when they do that, it will give it the sugars through its exudates again that it needs to regrow its membrane. And then the bacteria exits the plant, lacking the nutrients that it had when it went in. So it goes right back out into the soil and gets those nutrients again, but it knows that it can get carbohydrates from the plant. So it goes out, gets more nutrients, and then returns to the root.
You know if it makes a new cell wall or?
It does, yeah. It's
out. And so your question was if it was going to be able to split again while it was in the root.
So when it's outside,
My guess would be probably no, that it will, it'll be spit out empty, and then it'll go get nutrients, make its new cell wall. That's when it can split again.
Yeah, but
as much as I understand.
It does regrow the membrane before it can go back out into the soil and do its thing, though, because it can only live without the membrane as a protoplasm when it's because
inside the root.
It's inside the root's cytoplasm, So anyway, that's just one example of how that works. And coincidentally, I think they've discovered that like 40% of all nitrogen uptake is happening this way. So it's like another example of like how unnatural it is to feed fertilizer. When you got almost half of your nitrogen uptake in nature is coming from the rhizophagy cycle, like that is a mind-blowing fact that we didn't know until this decade. And we're learning more and more all the time. But again, the point is, we don't understand so much about nature that, like, for us to assume that we can do it better than nature is absolutely ridiculous.
Correlation to that ratio, because I know ones that are at least that 40% of photosynthetic energy goes into the soil to form sugars.
Correct. Yes.
40%.
Yeah.
So plant only uses 60% of the sugar. What's the rest of the ground?
Yeah, we mentioned that at the beginning of the class. Root exudates, when the plant photosynthesizes, the byproduct is carbohydrates, but it makes way more than it needs. 40% of it goes to feeding, sometimes more than 40%, goes to feeding microbes and establishing these relationships. Unless you're feeding fertilizers and the plant doesn't need to do that to get its nutrients, then it doesn't expend the energy to produce all of these exudates and form the relationships. So, you're
You
getting,
have to always feed fertilizer, right? Like that's what you're training your plant, is that don't learn how to do this yourself. I'm going to do it for you forever.
Yeah.
And you're putting it in a box, like we were saying before.
yeah, you get a one-dimensional product that lacks nutrient density and complexity and flavor and all of it when you're feeding nutrients like that. Some people get really good at it, and I'm not saying that people don't grow good weed or good crops using fertilizer. Nothing against that. I'm not trying to say this is the wrong way and this is the right way. It's just, this is what's happening, so we know there's a reason why more complex flavors and nutrient density occur when you grow this way. All right. Yes.
You talk about, inoculate and all these. How long does this take to bring your soil up to the level? Say you're not going to use any fertilizers anymore. You're going to use this. How long does it take to bring this soil up to a level that is sufficient for these plants?
Good. Very good question. That's the question. How long does it take to get your soil up to the level where it can support and it's good fertile soil for plant growth?
Especially if you're coming from a different way of growing.
Yeah.
Right?
That depends on what condition your soil is in to begin with. However, almost all soils have enough nutrition in them to feed your plants effectively. What is lacking is almost always the life. It's almost always the soil food web. And if you guys know who Dr. Elaine Ingham is, who coined the term soil food web and who started exploring this world with a microscope in the 80s, she's famous for saying over and over again to all farmers across the world that she lectures to, you have enough. You don't need any more phosphorus. You don't need any more nitrogen. You don't need any more, like almost no matter what soil you have. But it depends, how those nutrients are bound up and what microbes it's going to take specifically to unlock them. But in my experience, when you build a fresh soil like this, it's going to be ready to go within like a week, and I plant directly into it sometimes and stuff just starts off and it takes, you see it change though. Like you see the plant health improve after a couple weeks. And once you get we top dress the IMO and then about a week or two later, it's like the plants are really starting to love it.
You're not starting from scratch if you're remediating, and I think that's what you were saying.
Right.
It might take a little more time, especially if you're using the same plants that you've already trained not to be looking for nutrients themselves.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's going to be a whole new lesson for your plants to learn.
Well, it would be a new plant because it's a garden.
Sure.
So it'd be a new. Are you talking a year, 2 years, or what?
Sometimes.
It depends on the crop, and it depends. It's so hard because it's hard to say specifically. It might take 2 cycles, especially if you're doing a cover crop in between, to really re-regulate that, right?
Yeah. So for example, my Korean natural farming teacher, his name is Chris Trump, and he's very well known for bringing natural farming in this way back from Korea and proliferating it here. He has I think it's 700 or 800 acre macadamia nut farm on the Big Island in Hawaii. And, they were doing conventional agriculture techniques and stuff was really struggling. And he started to do these things when he came back. And I think he said, almost everybody says there is very noticeable results the first season. Now, whether or not you're back to where you want to be depends on where you're starting from. It might take a couple of years, but I would say even if you're starting from like an abysmal situation where the soil is horrible, 2-3 years, you're going to be in.
Reports I read say that, like a biochar, if you don't inoculate it, like we're talking about earlier, if you don't do that, you're going to get there.
Yeah.
But your production's going to die for a couple of years.
Right.
And then it's going to go back up.
Yeah. Yeah. So the same thing if you have a totally dead soil that has poor structure and not a lot of life in it, might just take a year or two to build it up. And, so it just depends.
But nature wants to correct herself and wants to be healthy. So it's going to, as soon as you start making moves that direction, things are going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. If you leave it alone, that's step number one. And any regenerative agricultural consultant is going to tell you, step number one, stop killing stuff. So if you're using pesticides, herbicides, and chemical salt fertilizers, stop doing that. That's step number one. And then you can begin the rebuilding process from there. So yeah. Okay. So the last bit on that slide just said, once you've got your food web in place, now it's time to start feeding it regularly. So we touched on mulch earlier, how often you want to mulch. I'll give you guys some examples as we go of what we do in a cannabis cycle.
No.
Yeah. It's just important to keep feeding the food web though. If the food drops off, the populations drop off. If the food ramps up, populations ramp up. So that's how that works.
Can you overdo anything here?
Inoculation, no, not really. Because
the plant's only going to take up what the plant needs.
Right. I mean, you're wasting time and money, but.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah. But like if I use IMO 5 times a week, it's just not going to make much more of a difference than once every 2 weeks or something. Yeah. But those extra microbes will just die if there's not enough food for them. So once you've got them in there, and this is the nice thing, like I said, with worms, you only have to do it once. With IMO, theoretically, you could just do it once and you'd be good. Big outdoor farms, that's more like what they do. Like Chris's farm in Hawaii, they'll do that a few times throughout the season. And they'll take a big spray rig out, getting pulled by a tractor, and they'll just drench everything, all the trees, all the soil, and they do that a few times a year. Because it doesn't make sense for them to do that every week like it might for us in a cannabis setting. So let's start with top dressing and amending. This is way number one that you'll use to rebalance your soil. So we recommend testing regularly to find out what is being taken out. So as you grow crops, they're going to remove nutrition from your soil. So you want to go through the process of designing and making like we talked about. You're going to retest regularly and then re-amend. I would recommend if you're growing weed, once every 1 to 2 cycles. And the way that you'll do this is once you get your recommendation, you can mix your amendments in, sometimes with the compost that you've got. Some amendments are also better to be put into water and solubilized, as Jared reminded me, because he just got a recommendation for his soil. And some of these things they say for even distribution, make sure that you just dissolve it in water and then water it evenly throughout. You can also mix your mineral amendments and even your organic amendments in with ferments, which we're going to talk about in a minute too. Fermenting things is a way to break them down before they start breaking down naturally. So they're pre-digested in a sense, kind of like kimchi or yogurt for a human. Like that's real easy on our stomach because it's already broken down. And it also carries with it the biology that did the breakdown. So it's an inoculation in itself. But you can also ferment minerals and stuff. Like sometimes when we put mineral powders down, we'll put them into our fermentation barrels first and let them go through the ferment with the rest of the material so that they get broken down a little bit ahead of time. And then again, just like before, remember to homogenize stuff evenly. So that's what you'll do for re-amending. Test, figure out what you're putting back in, decide how you want to put it back in, and then put it down on top of your soil. Once you've made your soil mix, you're not going to remix it. There are farms that do that. I've seen people in Colorado that say we're growing in living soil, but what they do is literally beds like that. They'll empty them out every single round after they harvest, and then they'll remix a bunch of new amendments back into the soil. That is insane to me because that is so much work and totally unnecessary. You can just mulch it, top dress it right on top, and it'll leach down in. And again, it's that 4 to 6 inches of topsoil that you're most concerned with. So get it cycling up there and it'll work. Go ahead. It could be whatever you're mulching with. So sometimes we ferment material and then we'll just top dress like raw fermented organic matter. Sometimes it's garden waste or kitchen food scraps. Here at Taproot, we're also sourcing beer grains, spent waste from breweries.
Sludge also that's gone through the ferment, everything.
Yeah. Because I mean, that's already fermented.
Yeah.
So that's a great, if you've got breweries, you can go talk to a brewery and be like, yo, what are you guys doing with your grain waste and stuff after it's,
Feed it to cows.
yeah, a lot of it's
For free.
yeah. Yep. They're giving it out for free. Breweries just are begging for people to come take this from them. And it's a killer amendment. It makes awesome compost. You can top dress it. It's probiotic. It's really good.
And you said feeding it to livestock too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep. So here we're talking about mulching. So
Next one.
next slide. Yes. Yeah. All right. So what do we want to mulch, right? And what does mulching do? Well, for one, it keeps your soil covered, which is very important. Having your soil covered prevents evaporation from the topsoil, and it keeps moisture in your top 4 to 6 inches, which again is where you want all that nutrient cycling to be happening because it's where all your feeder roots are at. So keeping that moist is really important. A lot of times when we're gardening and farming outside especially, and you see it everywhere you go, these fields that are just tilled up and the soil is bare. And then they plant a seed right into it, but that's just bare soil. If it's hot, that soil is going to get cooked by the sun. It's going to get exposed to oxygen and there's going to be a ton of evaporation. So the whole top 4 to 6 inches will be dry. There's just not a lot of life happening. But if you're farming with fertilizer, you don't necessarily care because you're mainlining that nutrient in. So mulching is a great way to keep your soil moist and covered. And then, of course, what you're doing is feeding organic matter to be broken down to your soil food web. So what you want to mulch depends on what you're trying to add to your soil. And the first thing I'll say is that you can never go wrong with carbon. Okay, so if you want mulch and you're like, well, I don't want to throw off my balance, so maybe I better not mulch a bunch of green stuff. You can use things like straw and wood chips. They're always great to go on the top because they're not going to bind up things like nitrogen unless you incorporate them in. But they will break down into carbon and into humus eventually. So, which you really can't have too much of that. So you can't really throw your soil out of balance by mulching things like straw or wood chips, unless you're going crazy and doing nothing but wood chips for like years or multiple cycles. But carbon's a good go-to. But then
What about different types of manures? There usually seems to be a distinction made quite often between compost and manure.
yeah,
But if it's well rotted, to me it seems like it's the same thing, carbon.
right. Yeah, if the manure is broken down, then it's kind of like top dressing compost. Interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure it's illegal to put raw manure on crops past a certain point.
Right.
Like it can't be close to the harvest because you don't want that in your food, right?
Same thing
Unbroken down.
with sludge, dried sludge from waste-related treatment plants. I thought before all that I ever knew, you couldn't use that for, maybe it's only for ornamentals now, I don't know.
Yeah.
I see it sold, but I thought it had too many heavy metals in it.
It does. And in case anybody was considering using, what do they call it? Biofertilizer, bio sludge or whatever from,
And they might
Yeah.
not give you a description of the ingredients with the metals. And
yeah.
Right.
It's not good though. It's never good for anything. So
I
yeah.
think they used to just worry about pathogens, and once they got past having pathogens in it, they said, okay.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. No, you don't want that. But manure, I'll get to that in just 1 second too. Manure can be great. I tend to avoid it and recommend doing primarily plant-based compost and mulching. However, animals are like a key part of every ecosystem. And when you incorporate animals the right way, it can be like the best thing you do. But that should be done. The way that we do manure is pretty unnatural. Like in nature, you don't see like all the cows getting
40
together
cows in one field.
and pooping on one area. You know, it's like, and you don't see a whole field get blanketed with manure, right? It's like there's a cow patty here, and then 10 feet over there, there's another one. And it's like that, right? So that's the way it's kind of meant to work in nature. When it comes to composting and mulching, I would recommend avoiding animal-based products, manures particularly, but you know, you might want to use other animal-based products like bone meal or blood meal or fish meal, things like that are good.
For what reason? Only for in consideration of the animals or in consideration of the garden?
The garden, yeah. It's pathogenic.
Free range chickens, and I vet them in straw, and they free range all day and come back and up.
Yeah.
That kind of manure you don't think is appropriate?
It could be okay. It could be okay. It needs to be well composted to make sure that all the pathogens are out of it.
And
Yeah.
you want it to be like it is in the woods.
Right. Now, you can, as long as you know how to make good aerobic compost that has had all the pathogens killed off, I think what it takes is you need to be above like 160 degrees for a certain amount of time, and then it will kill off all that stuff. Any compost that you buy that's made with animal manures is required to go through that process by law. So you can't sell compost if it's not done that way. But if you're making it for yourself, you just got to be sure that you know how to make good compost, which, you know, it can be pretty simple and straightforward. So I'm not trying to discourage people. Yeah, for like using animal waste is great. It's especially if they're your animals on your land, you know what you're feeding them. Like that's a totally different story. Just compost it well, and then don't make it the only thing you're doing, because again, diversity is the thing. The whole theme of everything we keep saying is diversity, diversity, diversity.
Right? Y'all seen the t-shirt?
Yeah. The more diverse it is, the more options your plant has to eat. So other options of things that you can mulch. Straw is kind of like a go-to for us. It's easy to get. I'm pretty much always putting down straw when I'm mulching. However, when I'm doing pruning events, when I'm cleaning up the understory of my plants, and also sometimes my cover crops are getting huge and out of control, I want to cut them back. So there's a thing called chop and drop, which is a catchy little phrase to remember, that you can just drop your prunings right back onto your topsoil. That's what would happen to them if you let the plant live its natural life anyway. It would just die and decompose in place. So that's a way to keep from removing a ton of nutrients from your soil, is make sure that anything you're not harvesting, for cannabis, it's our buds, right? Everything that's not the buds should go back into the soil. And if you're making hash with your buds and you're not using butane or some chemical to do it, like let's say you're making solventless water hash, take those buds after you extract the oils from them and mulch them right back on top of your soil again. You just want to keep, and so these are green waste materials, the prunings and the fresh cover crop, chop and drop. Those are what we call greens. And then carbons like straw and wood chips are browns. I just make sure that when I'm mulching, I kind of try and keep a balance of both. You know, maybe a little bit more leaning towards the carbon side. And if you have a good ratio of both, then it will encourage a good balanced breakdown, because there's going to be fungus that are on the carbon, like and on the wood chips. Fungus break down different things than bacteria. They break down lignins and fats and things like that, complex proteins that bacteria can't break down. So, but bacteria can break down fresh mulch and green material real easy. So again, keeping that diversity and that balance in your soil food web starts with your mulch. If you're mulching for balanced nutrition, you're mulching for a balanced food web as well. So chop and drop's awesome. If it's all a bunch of green stuff, I just add more brown in it with it. And yeah, that's all there is to say about that slide.
But just remember, I guess, that like nature mulches too, right? Like when the leaves all fall and are on the ground, unless you're raking them up in your yard, which is not necessarily the healthiest thing for the soil in your yard, but nature is doing that, right? And it's breaking down and it's going back into the soil. So mulching is still a natural thing to be doing with our soil.
You were saying the last time too, after harvest, that you chip all the stems.
Yeah.
And everything is a mulch too.
Yep. And then we ferment them sometimes. So I like to do, sometimes the mulch is fermented, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But like we've been taking a bunch of the hemp biomass waste from the previous season here at Taproot, and we've been stuffing 55-gallon drums full of it and fermenting it. And then, you know, we'll use that as mulch. Plus, you guys probably put just the regular stem and stalk out by itself too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
As much as we possibly can. This year, we're also getting a lot of leaf from the village here that sucks them up from everybody, which is huge. In the past, we did a lot more horse manures, but I think this is a way cleaner, better use of our waste streams. Again, using the brewery waste or coffee grounds from a bakery and stuff like that. Free resources is a great thing to get.
Yeah.
You know, so that's another big thing, especially at the size and scale that we're trying to achieve and do the mulching on our outdoor crops.
Yeah. These tree services, and like tree services don't know what to do with the wood chips that they've got. Like they're coming in, they're chopping trees down all the time and just chipping it all up, and they've got tons of it. You can get it for free almost in any case. You just got to be willing to do the homework and call some arborists and whatever and be like, hey, what are you doing with your wood chips? Also the towns, like Josh and them got in contact with Skaneateles or whoever, right? And they're just, it's crazy that we do it, but we rake all of these leaves up. Like that's the nutrition for our lawn and for those trees for next year. But because we don't like the way it looks, we rake them all up and put it by the curb for somebody.
I get salty about this. You like all fall. I was like, what are they doing to their lawns?
Yeah. But it's great for us, right? Because if we know about that,
Right.
like it's awesome to utilize the leaf waste from your neighborhood too. Because like most trees are never going to be sprayed with stuff like chemicals and stuff that you don't want. So like, but people have different species of trees on their land. So if you go around and collect up raked leaves that people are getting rid of, you're going to get a whole bunch of different sources of carbon, which then encourages that diversity again in the topsoil, in your compost that you make with it. But these are just some examples of ways to get free resources that you can mulch straight up, or you can compost and then mulch your compost later.
Oh, there's a hand.
Yes, sorry, I forgot about yours.
I realize the difference between the biochar and like say ash, but is there any benefit if you have like a wood burning stove to use that ash in your garden?
I believe that there can be, but I will not.
Really alkaline.
Well, it's
Really alkaline.
Yeah, probably so.
Structure either.
Yeah,
It's the structure that comes with biochar as much as anything else, because it's really inert.
I
Yeah.
mean, if you're
But
just talking
actually,
about
the
not
wood ash has
wasting it,
potash used to sell it in the revolutionary times.
Compost it.
Yeah. Yeah, compost it first would be a good idea. But yeah, I don't know of anyone that's like mulching ash straight up. Seems problematic, but I'm not an authority on wood ash, so I'm not going to say for sure. I would say probably not, though. Okay. This is our second to last slide. And cover crops are just awesome. They're like, you can't say enough good things about the benefits of having them, which we've talked about already. Because of the root exudate profiles being different with the more species you put in, that's going to put a lot of carbon in your soil that is going to be of different types and attract different life. The roots in the topsoil also hold moisture near the surface, which I think I already mentioned as well. But when, the grasses and stuff with shallow roots especially are really great for your biome, your microbiome in the soil, because not only are they producing tons of sugars and supporting big populations of microorganisms, they're also keeping it moist, and they're keeping your moisture content ideal in the topsoil, because those roots, are self-regulating that moisture by pulling it up from lower levels of the soil. And then when they die, when you terminate your cover crops yourself or they die naturally, those roots leave behind the tunnels and structure they created in the soil, and they also decompose and feed your soil food web directly. Also, chop and drop, like we just mentioned with mulching. If you're growing a bunch of different types of cover crop, you are providing yourself with your own source of diverse mulch. So that's a great benefit to it. And I'll go into an example of the cycle now. You can go to the last slide.
Will you put the cover crop on your indoor gardens?
Mm-hmm.
You will? What
Yep.
do you plan on those?
We haven't decided on a mix yet, but there's certain species that I really like a lot. I love oats because the root exudates that they produce encourage a population of microorganisms that is reducing in nature, which this is a whole nother topic we could do a whole nother class on, but certain microorganisms either oxidize or reduce the nutrition in your, and by reduce, what that means is they add electrons or take electrons away from the ions that are in the soil. So if something's oxidized, it's had electrons removed from it. If it's reduced, it's had electrons added to it. So oats are great because they provide some reduced microbiology that is good at fixing nutrition in a reduced form, as is the ferments. That's one of the reasons, another reason why we do fermentation is because the biology that ferments things does not need oxygen, and it is good at fixing microbes in the nutrients, I should say. It's good at fixing nutrients in the reduced forms. So when you mulch or incorporate fermented material, again, you're also introducing the species that did the fermentation to your soil, which then go into your soil and start to gather up nutrition the same way they do in the ferment, which is in a reduced form. So very helpful. Yeah. I love buckwheat because buckwheat produces a lot of biomass very quickly. And it's like this nice watery leaf and stem that just like almost melts into the soil. So when you chop and drop it, buckwheat is just like, it just turns into new soil really fast. It's really great. So I love the buckwheat for chop and drop, lots of biomass. I love things like vetch. Hairy vetch is a good one to add in. And then you've got a whole consortium of different nitrogen fixing plants. So
that's where testing your soil comes in again, right? So if you've tested your soil again after the run of your crops, you might know what it is that you're trying to get back in that soil. And
yeah.
That might change what you decide to have as your cover crop.
If you're low on nitrogen, which probably will never be the case, but like outdoors, it's more like it. Like if you're growing a field of corn, This is huge. Yeah, like there's a reason why farmers rotate their crops. And usually, like, let's say you're doing corn this year, farmers will typically come in with a legume after they've run corn. And that's because legumes fix nitrogen. They actually,
Run soybeans between corn.
yeah,
Exactly that.
yep. So what happens is, again, those exudates, they summon, the legume exudates call a certain specific type of bacteria called rhizobia to the rhizosphere, which is the root zone, right? Fancy word for root zone. These rhizobes are a type of bacteria that can take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into ammonia and nitrate. So they take the air, the gas that's in the soil, because our air that we breathe is actually a very high percentage of it is nitrogen. I can't remember how much, but it's like a lot, 60, 70% or more maybe. So there's a ton of nitrogen just locked up in the gas in your soil, in the air that's in the pores of the soil. And rhizobium can take that nitrogen out of the air and incorporate it into their bodies. And they actually grow some things like clover and certain types of legumes will grow nodules on the roots. So if you pull up the roots, you'll see a bunch of little like nodules on the roots. That's almost pure nitrogen. Those nodules are, after the plant dies, those nodules are left behind like little grains of fertilizer in your soil. So it's really amazing, like what cover crops can do for you is they can replace nutrition that's been taken out because of the associations they make with biology. So yeah, cover cropping, super huge.
Can I point out real quick, outside, as diverse as you possibly can get, it would be the best thing on a large, somewhat scale. On the inside, it might be a little bit harder to pull off. Some, we see a lot traditionally in these living soil beds as like a clover low mix. But it's a little bit different in that kind of environment, especially when you're growing cannabis with it too, and you're dumping these amendments on there a lot of the times. It's a little harder to do, but it definitely can be done.
Well, even in our pots, you can see there's like a little bit of companion crop going, right? And that's cool.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Those are actually the oats that sprouted. Somebody asked me about it. Those are the oats that sprouted from our IMO, because our IMO 3 mix has crimped oats in it, and they just started growing. And it's like, yes, we love oats. They're one of our favorites, right? So it's a change of mentality, because like a lot of times as farmers, we think of like this monocrop, monoculture model where it's like the only thing you want in your soil is the crop you're growing. Well, that's good if you're trying to get rid of stuff that's going to compete with your main crop, but a lot of stuff does not compete and is actually beneficial, way more than people think. So yes, you don't want an allelopathic weed growing. An allelopathic plant is one that produces enzymes or something like that kill everything else around it so it can take over in the soil. So you don't want to plant weeds like that, but there's plenty of great cover crops that you can get. Good resource for cover crops is a place called Green Cover Seed. I didn't include this in the slideshow, but Green Cover is an awesome company that you can call them up and be like, here's what I want to do with my soil. Like I want, in my garden outside, I want to have some plants that draw pollinators in. So I get bees and stuff, and they'll recommend, okay, use these few crops. Like when we did our hemp field, we had a 9 species blend of cover crops. When I'm indoors, it's usually 4 or 5. Build a Soil also has a cover crop blend that you can buy, which includes 4 different types of clover, vetch, millet, lentils, buckwheat, mustard greens and stuff. So, and also don't forget too, like you guys can grow stuff that you're going to eat in your beds. Like if you're growing weed, there's this whole portion of like from when you transplant till your plant is fully vegged, that stuff in the understory could get light. So you could grow crops that finish quickly or that produce, like in the last commercial facility I was at, we were constantly planting all sorts of lettuce greens because like we're feeding the crew with it. You know, like everybody's taking huge bags of lettuce and stuff home all the time just because we keep planting that. We like to grow aloe with the plants because aloe is just an awesome thing that the gel's got all sorts of beneficial properties. You can grow whatever you want. You might just want to make sure it's not allelopathic and it's going to mess with your crops. But we had freaking banana trees and tomatillos growing in the last place. If you guys ever want to check it out on Instagram, it's called Eden, Edun. And that's the last place that I was running in Colorado before I moved. And it's just the perfect example of how you do this at scale. And have it work. And we're about to do it here. So keep an eye on Taproot and watch how we pull this off. Because it'll be really cool. Like we plan on having mushrooms growing, like edible mushrooms in the understory. Probably going to have edible cover crops and stuff like that. Yeah. Nasturtium.
So long this year. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
They went so long in the season for us. And every time I walk by the greenhouse, I'd just be like eating all the flowers. And they're just an amazing peppercorny flavor and just good throughout the whole season. So I definitely want to try some of that.
Yeah. So awesome.
Yeah. And they're amazing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Question, so if you're gonna grow inside of the bed like that, you make up your own soil, it's amended properly, is it gonna have enough nutrients in it to get you through a complete grow?
Yeah. Yeah, this type of soil, especially if you're using large containers.
How big of, so that's part of the question too, how big of a container do you need to be in to where you think you can get through these cycles with nothing but water?
Okay, great two-part question. I'll repeat both. First question was, will it have enough nutrition, a soil like this, to get through an entire cycle? And then number two, how big of a container do you need to have in order for it to get through at least one or more cycles? My recommendation for no-till gardening methods like this is, we call it no-till because we're going to fill that bed and then we're not going to till it or disturb it or anything. We're just going to keep mulching on top of it and keep growing plants in it. But my recommendation for no-tilling a container is probably about 15 or 20 gallons. Once you get smaller than like 15 gallons, it's going to be real hard for that soil to have enough to keep a balance and keep feeding your plant. However, in a 15, I think you said you're in 15s, right? In a 15 with a soil mix like this, you might even be able to get through 2 whole cycles. And that's with just, you plant your plant in it and feed it plain water only. You could probably grow 2 crops in a row out of that before you had to do anything to it. Now, we don't recommend that. What we recommend is that you're mulching from day one, and that you're consistently re-inoculating with microbes, and you're testing and re-amending every 1 or 2 cycles at a minimum. You know, if things are healthy though, like it's the thing, like once you guys get 4 or 5 cycles under your belt in the same container, if you're doing it the way that we're talking about, you're going to be set for a while. Like stuff just gets really easy to grow because you're building it every time. Like we're starting with the ideal mix, but it's not as good as it's ever going to be from day one. And that's the beauty of this, is like, if you keep mulching, you keep testing and amending, and you're constantly growing plants in your soil is going to become better every single round, every crop. And this is the same for gardening outdoors, is it will start to get more fertile and more stable. And pretty soon you won't have to do much of anything at all.
I just want to put an asterisk on one of the things that you just said, which is always having plants in it. You know, we said it before, don't let it be empty and uncovered.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to be taking a step backward, right? That's why those cover crops and companion crops are important. That's why it's like, I just wanted to make sure that was really clear. Because if you chop your plants and then just let your soil dry out, you're going to have to start over again. It's going to be a step backward.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep it alive. That's the thing. So if you're going to have some time between crops in a container, it's a great idea to just plant some cover or something that you don't care about just to keep the container alive. Because if it all dies off, like if you let it go bone dry, you're going to have to start over. Your nutrition will still be there, but the life is not. So you're going to starting from square one.
All the way to the top, nearly so.
Yeah. Yep. So what I'm going to do now is we're just going to review everything we went over really quickly, but I'm going to do it in an example of what a cycle would look like for us. Okay. And then you guys can apply this to your own gardens and kind of do your own modified or not modified version of it, whatever you think is going to work best for you.
It is 5:45. So as he goes into this example, I know that we were kind of trying to be done around 6, but please hang out and ask questions and stuff. Don't feel like you have to jump right out the door.
Yeah, we're not in a hurry if you're not, right, Josh? Okay. And if you have to leave, go ahead too, of course.
Yeah, both sides of that.
Yeah. Okay, so you design your soil, you've mixed it properly, you've filled your container, you put your life in it. The management process would look something like this, okay? So we got a bunch of clones, maybe they're just a few inches tall, and we figure out our spacing, the density of it. We plant out our container, and we plant it with cover crops already growing. So depending on how big the cover crops are, you might need to cut them back or make, a little circle area for everywhere that you're going to transplant. And then you're going to manage it so that the cover crops don't outpace your cannabis. And this substitute any plant for cannabis, right? You just got to make sure that that main crop becomes the dominant crop, because you want it to be the one that's determining what's happening in the soil food web. So whatever's got the most roots and is the most dominant plant is going to be the one that's in charge of the soil food web via the root exudates, signaling, and communication that it has with the food web. So even though it's not going to be dominant at first if you have cover crops going, I recommend letting your cover crops stay alive as long as you can. So we plant in and we just cut things back so that the plant can establish and become the dominant species. And if you know how cannabis works, usually by the time you're ready to transition into flower, you'll have a canopy or a net or something over, you've got a certain area. If you're in a grow tent, you want to fill that space as much as possible, because we're trying to maximize the cubic footage and pack as much usable produce in there as we can. You want as much bud material as you can get. So as the crop gets bigger, it's going to start to shade out everything else underneath it in your soil, right? So a lot of your cover crop will start to die off naturally. It'll start to yellow out, and it's just going to start to die off. It's at about this point at the end of veg and early flower that we recommend terminating the cover crop. Now, it might not be every species of cover crop, because there's some species like dichondra, for example. We had a bunch of dichondra growing at Eden, and that dichondra is a perennial. So if you have perennial species that can just continually keep growing, perennials are awesome. They're like one of the best cover crops. So the dichondra, we didn't want to kill off because it'll just live indefinitely. And it also doesn't mind having very low light and shady conditions in the understory. So if you've got specific cover crops like that, you might want to leave them. But if you're growing like the combo we were talking about with like buckwheat and oats and rye and clover and stuff like that, those are all annuals. They're going to die off anyway when they stop getting light. It's a good idea to terminate them at this point and chop and drop them. So that's what we'll do a lot of the time, is we'll chop and drop our mulch, and it'll probably coincide with a pruning event where we're cleaning up the understory of the cannabis, getting ready for it to flower. And we will just mulch all of that direct. Unless there's like a ton of it, then we might remove some of it out of the system for a minute to ferment it and put it back in later. So that's one option. We don't always do the same thing every round. When you mulch all that green material, make sure to add some browns. Get your straw or your wood chips or whatever it is you're using for your browns in there. Okay, so now you got a dominant canopy of cannabis, and in your understory, it's full of mulch, okay? Those roots from the cover crops you just terminated are gonna break down, dissolve into the soil, and they're gonna be just the exact boost you need to get you through your mid-flower section, okay? So all the way up to like week 6, week 7 of flowering, if you're dealing with a typical 8 or 9 week strain, that is going to be the perfect timing to release all of those nutrients from the roots into the soil. And then you've got a backup of more decomposing material that you top dressed on top, breaking down as well. And that's going to give you plenty of a nice nutrient boost to get you through the rest of flower. Now, it's usually around like week 7 or week 8 that we'll come back in and replant cover crops. Especially if you're using fermented material in your mulch during flower. One thing that will happen is all of that cover crop that you chopped and dropped and all your prunings, it's going to break down really fast. It might even just be, especially if you have a lot of worms and stuff too, you'll just see that your layer, your mulch layer, is breaking down so fast that it's turning into humus and worm castings like before the end of your cycle even. So week 7, week 8, towards the end of your cycle, is usually the perfect time where you've got a nice tilthy layer of humus and worm castings on your topsoil to seed your next round of cover crop back into it. Now, it's not getting any light yet, right? Because your cannabis is still overshadowing everything, but you know you're going to harvest in like a week or 2. So this time you're typically on your dry back as well. And we didn't go into why you let the soil dry out at the end, but there's numerous reasons for that. Usually produces a little better results to let it dry back, and it mimics what happens in nature. Usually the soil gets a little more dry in the fall before harvest. And so that's the ideal time to replant some cover crop. Now, if everything's not broken down all the way, what you can do is take compost that you purchased or that you made yourself, and you can put down an inch layer or something on top of all of that mulch that's still breaking down. It'll help speed up the mulch breakdown because it's going to all be wet and decomposing underneath the compost. And it'll also give you that nice layer of compost to seed into. Now you've got all of these seeds, and you're gonna, if you're drying back, I recommend just using a light sprayer or something like that to keep your topsoil wet so that the cover crop will start to germinate. Ideally, your cover crop is all sprouting the day you harvest. So you harvest, it's all sprouting up, and now all the light is getting back to the surface of the soil again, and you've got a whole new round of cover crops that's going to spring up. And if you just keep up this cycle over and over again, you're going to build soil. Like,
Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you.
We have a dance recital.
Oh,
Have fun. Thank you for coming. So that's really it. Anyway, that is an example of how we would do it. Now, every round, we don't always reseed cover crop. Sometimes I'm like, okay, this time we're going to mulch a whole bunch of ferments. Sometimes we replant the cover crop. I recommend doing a new cover crop at least every couple of cycles. So like if you haven't done a cover crop in two rounds, you might want to consider either giving your container a break for a month or 2 while you do some cover crops, or see if you can time it properly. If you can time it properly, it's really awesome. But yeah, so that's an example of how you would go.
So I imagine this is all scalable up to like a big, huge farm operation.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's kind of hard to picture corn stalks with cover crop.
People do it.
yeah. So, and sometimes unintentionally. So I'll tell a true story
That's
about,
true.
about how my
Those
dad
are weeds.
accidentally grew morning glories between several rows of corn. And let me tell you, it kept the weeds at bay. It was really pretty to watch the morning glories come up the corn stalks. And then after we harvested, because it was sweet corn, after we harvested the sweet corn, the morning glories were still there. It was really beautiful. It was totally by accident. And it worked out really nicely.
No reduction in yield, probably, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, Dad just complained a lot because he was tripping over the vines.
Yeah.
I mean,
Now,
Old farmer complaint.
Your average farmer is going to see that and immediately dump glyphosate all over the ground, right? Morning glory, another name for that is bindweed. And it's like a very nuisance-y considered like weed. You know, people are like, oh my God, bindweed, kill it all with fire immediately. Like,
Sweet corn is such a short cycle. It was totally fine.
yeah.
It was totally fine.
I run a lot of my property with a farmer who puts corn, soybeans, and typical thing, you know. But every year I go out there, and you know he'll use some kind of weed killer. But corn's a monocot, and so are like leeks and onions.
Okay.
I can look out on this 1 5-acre field. There's probably 3 acres of ramps, what they call ramps or wild leeks. You know, every year.
Yeah.
Just out there
They're
hunting the other
delicious.
day, and I can see their little curly little sprigs sticking up already.
Nice.
Waiting for spring.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great. Did you have a question too?
Yeah, I have one more question. So we were talking about, so say for the 15 gallons, if that's the minimum you'd want to grow in to get through a complete cycle. So you're saying that the soil that we're going to build theoretically should have everything that that plant needs, right?
Yeah.
If you start seeing deficiencies halfway through your growth, how do you know it's not, it shouldn't be related to the soil?
It shouldn't. Yeah. It's probably, and you asked me this question on the break.
Follow up with, can you talk about watering a little bit?
Yes. Thank you for reminding me. So if you are seeing issues, it probably, especially if you're in a smaller container, if you're in a big thing like this, you know, you have to overwater a lot to start seeing stuff get unhealthy, you know, especially with a good mix with nice drainage. But it's easier to do in a smaller container, to overwater, I mean. So if you start seeing deficiencies, it is probably something to do with your watering. And watering properly is something that just takes practice if you're doing it by hand. And if you're doing it in an automated fashion, it takes data collection and observation. So you just have to look. One way of collecting data on your soil moisture content is to use a meter. So there's soil moisture meters of all different kinds, tensiometers. There's all sorts of different types of soil moisture meters. Looks like Josh is going to get an example of one here. I knew it.
Great. He's just like, oh, I got that.
He gets up and I'm like, yeah.
Basic.
1 second, I'll get to that too.
Some they make longer than others too, but it's, 0 to 10, and you're just constantly, some actually will relay if you, have a dedicated spot and want to, monitor it from your house and just, or alarms. Sky's the limit now, and relatively pretty cheap too. Some are better than others.
Yeah.
And you want to probably not chimp out too much if you're trying to really take it, seriously.
Yeah.
And having backups also helps too, because it sometimes doesn't always work out, especially technology sometimes. The simpler ones typically are the best ones.
Yeah.
With that.
Yeah. Now, another thing I'll say about meters is that they're not always accurate per se, right? Like, and even the same type of meters, like I used to use these Blue Mat moisture meters, these things are called. And those things, I would have 6 of them and I could put them all right next to each other in the same container and they'd read 6 different things. So some of them require constant calibration to keep them on point. Some of them, you just might want to have a couple different types. But the thing to remember is there's not a specific number to shoot for because of the inaccuracy of these things. Like Blue Mat will tell you, oh, you want 100 millibar of pressure, on registering on the meter. Well, that's fine if it's accurate, but what if it's reading 100 and you're at 50, like that, and that happens regularly. So what I recommend is to use a meter, but figure out, and you kind of may have to know this or figure this out by watching your plants and your health, figure out what reading on that meter is really the best reading for your moisture. Now, another way to check soil moisture is just the old-fashioned squeeze test. You can take some of your soil, grab it in your hand, and squeeze it. If you get if you should get just a little bit of water, like 1 drop. And this is what most experts will say is, squeeze it. If you get 1 drop of water coming out, that's the right soil moisture content. If it's more than that, it's too wet. If it's less than that, it's not wet enough. So that's one way to check manually. And just getting your hands in your soil is super important. We should be doing that regularly anyway, just so we can see with our own eyes the life that's in there. Like, pull back your mulch layer regularly. Look at how it's decomposing. Make sure that your topsoil is staying moist and your moisture contents are on point where you want them. But watering, just to wrap this up, watering is something that takes, it's a learned skill, so getting really good at that is something that you'll learn by paying close attention. And there isn't a formulaic approach where it's like necessarily 100 millibar on a blue mat meter. It can be if it's accurate, like I said, but if you're going to rely on that, then you better make damn sure that you're testing the accuracy of your meter, But better yet, figure out how to know by the look, by the feel, even by the smell. Like the way that your soil smells, just like your IMO too. When you make IMO, it's all about the smell. If it smells a certain way, it's working. Ferments, same thing. If you smell putrid smells, that's usually a sign of anaerobic activity. It's a breakdown without oxygen, and it's putrefaction. Those smells of sulfur and poop and rotten things, stuff like that. If you're smelling that, your soil's way too wet. You're probably overwatering, and you want to take it back to get that aerobic life going again. And then you had a question next.
pH still important in this method?
Yeah, I was waiting for someone to ask that.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
I know a lot for this pH and not.
Yep.
pH is very difficult to measure in the field.
It is.
Unless things have changed in 20 years.
I have the
Yeah.
labs, right?
Yeah, Blue Lab makes
It's about pH, just so everybody's
for the recording, pH. Does it matter? How does it matter? Yes, it does, but not nearly as much as it would in a conventional agriculture system or your typical cannabis grow. If you're growing hydroponic in soilless mediums, things like that, it's critical because soluble nutrition's only plant available within a certain range. And there's charts that will show you this, like this nutrient gets uptaken between 6 and 7 pH or whatever. In soil that's living soil like this, you don't really need to worry about it. You don't need to pH your water or anything like that if your soil's healthy. And if you think about it, it's because the soil food web is self-regulating the pH. It's kind of like your body. Everybody's all about this alkaline water and stuff now, but I think if you look into it, you'll find out that your internal organs need to stay at a constant pH. Like it cannot, your blood has to be a specific pH all the time. Otherwise, you're going to straight up die, and you can't, like, you have to, so your body's self-regulating that just like the soil food web is.
I'll put that on a t-shirt too.
Yeah.
He says things, I just like throw it on t-shirts.
That's how we got these. So anyway, pH does not really matter if you got a good, healthy living soil. Like a lot of people are dealing with water that's a pH of 8 or 8.5, even higher. And they're like, oh, shoot, like, do I need to do something about this? Oh, yeah. Oh, and you asked me. Yeah. Yeah. So this is another thing. If you're not on well water, this is why you want to test your water too. I didn't emphasize this a lot, but it is pretty important. Even in a living soil that's very well buffered, because all those bioslimes and films and all of that life, everything that it's living in, it's creating its own atmosphere, just like our body does. It self-regulates our internal pH. But chlorine and chloramine are common additives in water that are meant to kill microorganisms. And they do that very effectively, which is why municipal water uses them. If you're watering your living soil with it, it probably will have an impact. Now, I've done entire cycles on city water, City of Denver water, so a lot of other municipalities too. And I have looked at what they put in, and they've used different things. I usually don't do anything. I'm on Chittenango public water right now. Plants grow fine with it. I looked it up. It's not chlorine or chloramine. It's a different thing that they use. But, you know, the soil food web is so powerful. It will handle most of what you put in. However, get your water tested. And if it's ridiculous, like, you might want to do something.
If you're on city water, we learned this, you know, if you're on a town or municipality water, you can go to their website or to their town and you can ask for what is in the water and get a whole breakdown.
I think it's online.
Yeah, we ended up going through the Aqua website on
Yeah.
the county water authority. And it's available there. So start there is what I guess I wanted to say. Start with that if you're using city water.
Yeah.
And get that information first.
We found out that, so our water comes from Skaneateles Lake, I think, to Chittenango. And I think what they use in this lake, Aqua uses like sodium chloride or some other form of chlorine chloride. Yes, that's what they're using. And so I just did a little research on that and found out that it's actually a little milder version of regular chlorine or chloramine. But if you have chloramine, that's probably the worst one. You can't get it out very easily.
Citric acid or humic acid.
Yes.
It's like a quarter teaspoon of citric acid per 5-gallon barrel.
Yeah.
I think it's bicarboxylic chloride or something, so you gotta be careful.
Yep. And we were talking about this on the break too. So what he just said is you can use humic acid if you have chloramine. Chlorine, regular chlorine, will off gas naturally. You can also just, interestingly enough, stick your arm in it and stir it around for like 10 seconds, and your skin will absorb all the chlorine out of chlorinated water. It's
That's cool.
kind of weird and messed up, right? But with chloramine, it's a different molecular structure and it doesn't off gas easily and it's more locked up in the water. Humic acid is one of the ways that you can use to kind of remove or at least change that molecular structure. But you want to be careful. What you mentioned was like a quarter teaspoon per 50 gallons or something. So that is a very, very small amount. And if you're going to use humic acids to try and remove chlorine or chloramine from your water, just make sure that you use very small amounts. Humic acid is a very strong chelating agent, which means it binds to nutrient ions and it will change the molecular structure, most of the time making it bioavailable. So sometimes people, when their plants are unhealthy, will use a dose of humic acid to release some nutrition from their soil, but you can actually burn your plants doing that. So humic acid is one that you want to be careful with. Yes, you can. You can, in fact, when we make liquid IMO, we put some humic acid in and we're bubbling and aerating. So that kind of helps it stabilize. But as far as any chelating agent is concerned, I usually recommend avoiding them as much as possible in the soil, because chelation is what your microbes are doing. The soil food web is producing their own organic acids and secondary metabolites that are binding with the nutrition in your soil. They're doing that naturally. So again, that's what makes nutrients bioavailable in many cases. If you come in with a chelated product, so this is where organic nutrients come in. It's like a lot of organic nutrients. They're organic because they're not like a chemical salt. But what they usually are is, say, like a very ground up mineral, like a micronized mineral dust, which is then combined with some kind of organic acid, which chelates it into a plant available form. Then you're putting that in and feeding it direct to your plant, again, bypassing the soil food web. So the reason why we always recommend staying away from chelates, using too much humic acid in your water or in your soil, is because it kind of shortcuts the natural process of creating those organic acids that's happening already. And it,
Mess that up and then it has to be recreated again, right?
Yeah.
You're you're training then the microbes not to do their job. It's all about like keeping things the way they should be.
Yeah.
You overwrite that training.
Yep. Yeah, there's tons of humic acid in compost, in anything that's breaking down. Like humus, again, is the furthest broken down version of organic matter. So that word humic and humic acid, humus, biodegrading organic matter is going to create a ton of it anyway.
All over the wood.
Exactly. It is. Yeah. So, question.
So you collect IMO, you get to IMO 4, you've used compost and outdoor soil, and then you move it indoors. Like, what would you use for like pest management?
Yeah. So pest management, or IPM, stands for Integrated Pest Management, is the acronym for it in gardening. We could do a whole class on IPM as well.
Put it on your car.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you going to do some more of these? Did you mention
Yep.
that? Or?
Yep. This is our second one, and we're going to keep doing this every 5 or 6 weeks, probably, maybe once a month.
And what I was talking about sugar content and whatnot, and
Yeah.
pests, insect pests, that would be something that would go together well.
Right.
I know the research on that sugar, I don't think it's all that old, and I didn't see anything. I saw one report in YouTube or something, and read a report, and that's all I found that was impressive.
Yeah. There's a lot of new science coming out about it too. So,
I
you know.
will
But I didn't see much that I was impressed by, but I saw enough that it was plausible and sounded important.
Yeah.
I wanted to use it. So I-
Yeah. The key takeaway from that conversation, and to also touch on your IPM question at the same time, is that a healthy soil food web is going to create disease and pest resistant plants naturally, because the variety and diversity of secondary metabolites that your microorganisms are producing, is a lot of them are actually immune response triggers. So plants have a couple immune response pathways. One is called the SAR, systemic acquired resistance. The other one is called ISR, which stands for like immune something, I can't remember. But those two pathways are triggered by things like salicylic acid, and chitinase is another one. Like an enzyme that microorganisms produce to break down chitin is something that triggers these immune responses. And like there's products out there that you can feed that are like salicylic acid products or chitinase products, chitosan.
Plant, then you're saying, and then make it repulsive to an insect?
Yeah, it actually triggers like immunity. You know how like as humans too, we can boost and activate our own immune systems by doing like this OHN that we have over here. That's a Chinese medicine recipe. It's 5 fermented herbs that are tinctured. And when you drink that stuff, it's known to trigger the ginger, the garlic, all these different herbs that we ferment and put in there. Those things activate your immune response. So,
That's what we should have been doing always.
yeah, right.
One thing it was mentioned by a fellow that I seen, he was kind of weird, but he seemed to know his stuff, best I saw.
It's like
Once you get to 8%, most insects aren't going to attack a plant, 8% sugar.
Yeah, yeah.
But between 8 and 12, there's still grasshoppers, and you have to get above 12.
Yeah.
And that is difficult to get that high
Yep.
with sugar in a plant.
We consistently see Brix levels above 20 in our plants. Just as an example here.
You?
Yeah. Yeah.
So can I get that in squash, you think?
Oh yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I got to work on that, and I got to listen to you next.
Yeah.
Next.
So a quick recommendation to anyone who's interested in immune response, Brix levels and things like this. Check out a guy named John Kempf, Kempf.
Would you spell that again?
John Kempf,
Oh, Kemp, okay.
Kempf. He's an Amish guy that has an agronomy firm that's international. They work with millions of different acres. Yeah, they're Advancing Eco Agriculture is the name of their company, and
Advancing Eco-Culture?
Advancing Eco Agriculture.
Okay.
John Kempf is the founder. He's got a lot of YouTube videos and material online if you want to check it out. It's killer. Yeah. Yeah. I could listen to this guy forever. And he's super smart and he's an excellent communicator. So he's got this thing called the Plant Health Pyramid that I would look into if you're interested as well, which he's categorized different levels of plant health and what's happening at each level. So when it comes to increasing Brix levels and sugar content in your plant, I wouldn't say that it's just the sugar that's deterring pests. It's the overall level of plant health which results in that much sugar being present in your plant. Because
This is where I was getting. I wondered, how do I get to that level?
Yes,
There's gotta be
yeah.
parameters involved.
right, and if you listen to John's thing about the plant health pyramid, he talks about the different levels. And level one and level two of the plant health pyramid are all about maximizing photosynthesis. So again, the byproduct of photosynthesis is carbohydrates. The sugars and the Brix levels of your plants are coming from the photosynthetic activity. So the more photosynthesis that's happening and the more complete photosynthesis that's happening, that means formation of more complex sugars rather than just like glucose and the simple sugars, right? When you have complete and full photosynthesis happening, the profile of carbohydrates your plant is producing is going to be much more and much better quality. And so if you can increase photosynthesis, that's going to help a lot. Sometimes it's hard outdoors. Like our plants can get real unhealthy when the sun goes away for a week straight around here. Not much you're going to do about that, but indoors, we have a lot of control, and outdoors, we have a lot of control just by monitoring plant health. So this is a whole nother possible topic, which I'll take right now, the opportunity to remind you guys to fill out your forms. Let us know what you want to hear about next time. And we selected the one that everybody picked the most this time. So
Yeah, we really do. We go through these pretty aggressively afterwards to see what you guys want to do. And so whatever you want to learn about next, let us know now.
there's a whole conversation we could have about how to test your plant sap along with your soil at the same time and find out what micronutrients are missing that when you put them back in will ramp up your photosynthesis like crazy. And I have actively, I'm telling you, some of you growers might not believe this, especially if you've operated on a commercial scale ever. When you see spider mites or aphids or something show up in a garden, especially when it's like a big greenhouse with ideal conditions for these type of pests, you see them show up, the average grower is like, oh crap, we got to nuke everything. Get out the pesticides. Like you got to nip it in the bud immediately before that problem spreads throughout your entire greenhouse. Well, the good news about growing this way is that for one, you won't see that happen as readily as you do normally. Like you might see one plant get spider mites on it, but then it just won't spread. There will be other plants that are literally touching it with the leaves overlapping. And if the plant next to it is healthy, the mites will not go anywhere else. They'll stay on the one plant. But my direct experience has been that if you're testing your plant sap and you can figure out what micronutrients are missing that might be hindering your photosynthesis, we would spray them onto the plants foliarly in a chelated form. Because again, I don't want to put chelates in my soil and shortcut the food web, but I can spray chelates onto my leaf surfaces. And if they're in the right forms, that nutrition will get absorbed foliarly and it will fill in the gap of what's missing, like the weakest link in photosynthesis, right? Then your photosynthesis levels will increase and we straight up reverse infestations, like full-blown infestations of entire, like we had a 40-foot long bed that was just getting hit by aphids. And we were like, what the heck's going on? So we tested it. We found out there's a high level of ammonium in the plant sap, which is what aphids love. They want ammonium. So we were like, well, if we ramp up our photosynthesis, all of this simple nitrogen is going to get converted quickly. And so you won't have, and you can test your sap. If your plants are healthy, the level of ammonium and nitrates in your plant sap should be 0. And that's not because it's not taking up, nitrate especially is the main form that nitrogen's uptaken in. So to find zero nitrates in your plant sap, what that means is that your metabolism of your plant is combining those nitrogen with other things like carbohydrates. And the next step up would be like an amino acid. So it takes a nitrate and an ammonium or whatever and combines it with carbohydrate. You have an amino acid. So your sap test will give you the overall reading of total nitrogen. So you should have real good levels of high total nitrogen, but zero nitrates and ammonium. And that'll be in the form of, your total nitrogen will be in the form of amino acids, proteins, peptides, more complex molecules of nitrogen. And we can monitor those things. So if that's something you guys want to learn about, maybe in a future class, we can talk about sap analysis and, adjustment during your growth cycle. Because we literally, these guys that own the farm I was consulting for, they were like, you're crazy. We need to spray pesticides. We need to kill this infestation now. And I was like, just trust me. If we get the plants healthy enough, they will just go away. And that's exactly what happened. We did it time after time, and they'll never go back to using a pesticide again because they realize that if they can manage their plant health, they just don't have pests and disease. So, yeah.
Winning.
Yep. All right.
Are there any other questions?
I just have one more. What does KNF stand for?
Korean natural farming.
Use any Jadam inputs or just?
Not usually. I've used a little bit of Jadam, but my opinion of Jadam is that KNF is superior in pretty much every area except for IPM. So things in Jadam that I do use occasionally are like Jadam sulfur and JWA is Jadam wetting agent. Those are great for pest knockback. Like when we had that aphid infestation I was just talking about, we actually did use JWA to knock them back. And then we sprayed the nutrient foliar and, it was successful.
I just want to, I know everybody's packing up and everything. I just want to really say thank you all again for being here.
Yeah.
Really means a lot to us.